Around 1100 AD, if you stood on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River near what's now St. Louis, you would have seen something that shouldn't have existed. Not yet. Not there. A city. A real city, with more people living in it than London had at the time. More people than Paris. Somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 residents packed into a few square miles of floodplain, with tens of thousands more scattered across the surrounding farmland. This was Cahokia, and for a few centuries it was the largest city north of Mexico. Nothing else in North America came close. Picture it. Massive earthen mounds rising up from the valley floor, one of them so large it covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Wooden posts arranged in a giant circle, tracking the sun with a precision that would make modern astronomers raise an eyebrow. Plazas full of people trading, worshipping, playing games, building lives. Smoke rising from thousands of hearths. This wasn't a village. This wasn't a scattered collection of farming communities. This was urban life, complex and organised centuries before European contact. And then, within a few generations, it was gone. Not gone, like the buildings crumbled overnight. Gone like the people left by the 1300s. The plazas were quiet. The population had collapsed by some estimates to a fraction of its peak. By the time European explorers eventually made their way up the Mississippi, they found mounds, yes, impressive, mysterious mounds, but no city. No thriving metropolis, just earthworks slowly being reclaimed by prairie grass and forest, and a landscape that gave almost no hint of what had stood there just a couple centuries before. So what happened? Why did one of the most sophisticated and populous societies in pre-Columbian North America simply come apart at the seams? That's the question we're chasing today, and I'll be honest with you up front. There's a version of this story that gets repeated a lot online. The idea that Cahokia was abandoned overnight, like everyone just packed up and walked away in a single dramatic exodus. It makes for a great headline. It is not, strictly speaking, what the archaeology shows us. The real story is messier than that, and, honestly, more interesting. It's a slow unraveling stretched across decades, maybe even a century or more. It's environmental stress creeping in year after year. It's political structures straining under their own weight. It's possibly disease moving through a densely packed population that had never dealt with urban crowding before. It's evidence of violence and even ritual killing that suggests a society under real internal pressure. It's belief systems that may have failed the very leaders who depended on them to hold power. And it's people, real people, making decisions to leave, to migrate, to rebuild their lives somewhere else entirely. We're going to walk through all of it. The rise, the astonishing peak, and then piece by piece, the evidence for why it fell apart. Because Cahokia's story isn't really about vanishing. It's about transformation and understanding that difference might tell us something important about how complex societies handle stress even today. Before we get into all that, I'd love to know who's listening tonight. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuned in from and what time it is where you are. I read these every morning with my coffee, and it's honestly one of my favourite parts of making these videos, seeing this little map in my head of insomniacs and history nerds scattered across every time zone on Earth. And if you're enjoying these stories, the single best way to support the channel is to find the show on Spotify. Listen there if you can, and if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and the link is right there in the description. Alright, let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk about what North America looked like before Cahokia became Cahokia. Picture the Mississippi River floodplain a few centuries before anyone started piling up earth into mounds. This wasn't just any patch of land where the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers come together. You get something ecologically rare, a floodplain so rich in resources that it's sometimes called the American Bottom. Fertile soil renewed every year by flooding, wetlands full of fish and waterfowl, forests thick with deer, nuts and edible plants. This was, in the language of ecology, a resource patch of exceptional productivity, the kind of place that can support far more people than the land around it. And people had known this for thousands of years before Cahokia existed. Long before any city rose here, woodland-era communities were already living across this landscape, going back over 2,000 years. These weren't primitive scattered bands stumbling through history, waiting for someone to invent civilization. They were sophisticated societies in their own right, building smaller mounds for ceremonial and burial purposes, developing long-distance trade networks that moved copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf Coast, creating art and technology that took real skill and real social organization to produce. They lived in semi-permanent villages, hunted, fished, gathered wild plants, and slowly, gradually began cultivating a small set of native seed crops. Goosefoot, marsh elder, little barley, not exactly the foundation of an empire, but a start. Then something shifted, something that would eventually change everything. Maize, corn agriculture had been developing in Mesoamerica for thousands of years, and slowly, through trade and migration and probably a fair amount of experimentation, it made its way north. By around 800 or 900 AD, maize cultivation was becoming increasingly important in the American Bottom. And this mattered enormously, because maize, unlike a lot of native crops, produces a huge caloric surplus for the labour invested. It stores well, it can support population densities that older subsistence strategies simply could not sustain. This is the part of the story that often gets skipped over in favour of the dramatic mounds and the mysterious collapse, but it's arguably the most important piece. Food surplus is what allows some people to stop spending all their time growing food and start doing other things. Building monuments, organising labour, developing religious authority, trading over long distances. Without that surplus, none of what came later was possible. So archaeologists talk about a gradual transition happening here, out of the late woodland tradition and into what we now call the Mississippian cultural tradition. It wasn't a single invention or a single migration. It was decades, maybe a century or more, of communities growing larger, more settled, more socially complex, more dependent on maize, more organized around emerging religious and political structures. Villages were consolidating, populations were rising. The pieces of something bigger were quietly assembling themselves in the background. And this is the point worth sitting with before we go any further. Cahokia did not appear from nowhere. It wasn't a sudden miracle dropped onto an empty landscape. It was the product of centuries of ecological advantage, agricultural innovation, and social development that had been building, layer by layer, for generations. What happened next wasn't really the beginning of something new. It was an explosion, a sudden acceleration of forces that had been quietly gathering for a very long time. And then, around 1050 AD, the slow build-up suddenly became something else. Archaeologists call this the Loman phase. It lasted only a few generations, roughly from 1050 to 1100. But during those few decades, the American Bottom underwent one of the most dramatic transformations in the pre-Columbian history of North America. A landscape that had contained scattered villages, farmsteads, older ceremonial places, and small communities began reorganizing around a single enormous center. Cahokia didn't just grow, it surged. This is why some archaeologists have called it a kind of Big Bang. Not because the city appeared literally overnight, and not because everyone agrees on exactly how fast it happened. Archaeology deals in layers of soil and broken pottery, not census records. but the evidence points to a remarkably rapid concentration of people, construction, and political power. Within perhaps a few decades, Cahokia became the dominant settlement in the entire region. Think about what that means in human terms. A child born in a modest farming village around 1040 might have grown up watching a city form around them. Not a city in the modern sense, with stone streets and towers and written laws, but a true urban centre, dense populations, monumental public spaces, neighbourhoods arranged around shared plans, specialised labour, social classes, religious authority, and networks connecting people across enormous distances. For generations, people had lived throughout the floodplain in communities of manageable size. Then something began pulling them inward. Families arrived from the surrounding uplands. Farmers came from the Illinois River Valley, from the Mississippi Valley to the north and south, from eastern Missouri, from areas that are now Indiana and Wisconsin. We can't identify every route or every community with certainty. But the archaeological evidence suggests that Cahokia's growth was not simply the result of local families having more children. It involved migration, lots of it. People were moving into the American bottom. You can see hints of this in the pottery. Different communities had different ways of making vessels, decorating them, tempering clay, shaping rims. At Cahokia, archaeologists find traditions that appear to have roots in multiple surrounding regions. You can see it in the layout of neighbourhoods where households may have preserved building styles and habits brought from elsewhere. And in some cases, chemical analysis of human teeth suggests that at least some people buried at Cahokia spent their childhoods somewhere else. This was not one village slowly expanding until it filled the floodplain. It was a gathering. But why would people leave familiar land, familiar ancestors, familiar local leaders, and move toward this growing centre? Food was probably part of the answer. The American bottom was exceptionally fertile, and maize agriculture was becoming more productive and more central to everyday life. A newcomer arriving near Cahokia would have found rich soil, access to rivers and wetlands, forests full of game and wood, and a landscape capable of producing surplus. In uncertain times that matters. A good harvest is never just food. It is security. It is the difference between feeding your children through winter and watching stored grain run out. But food alone does not explain Cahokia. There were plenty of fertile places in eastern North America. There were plenty of river valleys where maize could grow. What made Cahokia different was that food was becoming connected to power, ritual, and opportunity. Something extraordinary was happening at this place. Leaders, religious specialists, builders, traders, farmers, and labourers were creating a centre so large that it may have seemed impossible to ignore. If you lived within a few days' journey, you would have heard stories. Earthworks rising from the plain, ceremonies drawing crowds, feasts where food was distributed in quantities no ordinary village could provide. Powerful people claiming access to forces that controlled fertility, weather, ancestors, the sun, or the cycles of life and death. And perhaps that was enough to bring people in. Maybe some arrived because they believed Cahokia's leaders had spiritual authority. Maybe they came to participate in ceremonies that promised renewal and protection. Maybe they were invited by kin who had already settled there. Maybe ambitious young people saw the city as a place where they could gain status, marry into new networks, trade valuable goods, or escape the limits of a small village. Or maybe some came because the world outside Cahokia was becoming more dangerous. That possibility is harder to prove. We should be careful here. There is no single piece of evidence saying refugees fled to Cahokia in fear. But large centres can offer a kind of security. More people means more allies. More food stored in one place means help after a bad harvest. Powerful leaders can organise defence, settle disputes, and control access to land. For families living on the margins, moving closer to a regional centre may have looked like a rational gamble. You give up some independence, but you gain access to protection, ritual, trade, and a bigger social world. And once that process started, it may have fed on itself. The more people arrived, the more labour Cahokia had. The more labour it had, the more impressive its monuments became. The more impressive the monuments became, the more authority its leaders appeared to possess. And the more authority they possessed, the easier it became to attract more followers, more farmers, more craft workers, more people willing to build. It's a feedback loop. Population creates power. Power attracts population. The physical evidence for this coordination is everywhere in the ground. During the Loman phase, builders began reshaping the landscape on a scale no previous community in the region had attempted. Enormous quantities of earth were dug, carried, and packed into mounds. The central area was organised around a vast open plaza. Residential zones expanded outward. Buildings were constructed and rebuilt according to shared orientations. Borrow pits where soil was removed for construction became part of the engineered landscape. None of this happened by accident. Moving earth sounds simple until you consider the numbers. There were no draft animals pulling carts, no iron shovels, no machines. Soil had to be loosened with digging tools, loaded into baskets, carried by human beings, dumped, packed down, and repeated again and again. A mound is not just a pile of dirt. It is thousands upon thousands of individual decisions to show up, carry a load, and do it again tomorrow. For a project like this to work, someone had to organise labour. Someone had to decide where the mound would go. Someone had to coordinate food for workers, materials for buildings, access to land, and the rituals that made collective work meaningful. Even if Cahokia's leaders did not command people in the way a modern government does, they clearly had the ability to mobilise effort on an astonishing scale. That is what archaeologists mean when they talk about sudden urbanisation. They do not mean that Cahokia suddenly became a modern city. They mean that the rhythms of life changed. People began living closer together. Public spaces became larger and more formal. Work became more specialised. Social differences became more visible. Monument construction became continuous, rather than occasional. A place that had once been one community among many was becoming the centre of an entire regional system. And this transition seems to have been planned, at least in broad outline. The huge central plaza was not simply whatever open ground happened to remain between houses. Its scale and location suggest deliberate design. Major mounds were positioned in relation to it. Structures and neighbourhoods appear to have followed organising principles that tied the settlement together. Even the way the landscape was modified suggests that Cahokia's founders were thinking beyond one household, one season, or one generation. They were building for crowds. They were building for ceremonies. They were building for a future in which thousands of people would look toward the same central place and understand that it mattered more than anywhere else around them. But here is the problem. We still do not know what set the whole process in motion. Was it a charismatic leader, or a new religious movement capable of uniting scattered communities? Was it the arrival of maize varieties productive enough to support a much larger population? Was it competition between local groups, with one faction gaining an advantage and pulling others into its orbit? Was it climate stability, good harvests, and a sequence of fortunate years that made rapid expansion possible? Was Cahokia a destination for migrants seeking opportunity? Or was it a place where leaders actively recruited people, offered feasts, land, protection and belonging? It may have been all of those things. The evidence does not support one clean explanation. Cahokia's boom was probably not caused by a single king, a single battle, a single invention, or one miraculous harvest. It was more likely a convergence: fertile land, productive maize, existing trade routes, population movement, religious innovation, ambitious leadership, and a social system capable of turning belief into labour and labour into monuments. Whatever the spark was, it worked. By the end of the Loman phase, Cahokia was no longer just a promising settlement in a rich floodplain. It had become something unprecedented north of Mesoamerica, a metropolis rising from the Mississippi Valley, built from earth, maize, ceremony, and the labour of people who had come from far beyond its horizon. And that word, metropolis, is worth taking seriously. Not because Cahokia looked like a modern city, it did not. There were no paved avenues, no stone apartment blocks, no written street signs, no market districts marked on maps. Most buildings were made of wood, thatch, clay, and packed earth. Their walls decayed, their roofs collapsed, their streets were paths worn into the soil by generations of feet. But in 1100 AD, if you stood on the floodplain near the Mississippi River, Cahokia would not have felt like a village. It would have felt enormous. The heart of the settlement was a planned ceremonial core, dominated by massive earthen mounds, broad plazas, large public buildings, and open spaces built to hold crowds. Around that centre stretched dense residential districts. Houses stood in clusters, often around small courtyards or neighbourhood spaces. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children ran between homes. Farmers carried maize from nearby fields. Potters shaped vessels. Craft workers turned stone, shell, bone, copper and wood into tools, ornaments and objects with ceremonial meaning. And beyond those neighbourhoods, Cahokia kept going. There were smaller mound centres, villages, farmsteads, fields, gardens, wetlands, forests, river landings, and satellite communities spread across the American bottom. This was the broad floodplain between the Mississippi River and the bluffs of what are now Illinois and Missouri. It was one of the richest agricultural landscapes in eastern North America. Rivers brought water, seasonal floods renewed soils. Wetlands offered fish, waterfowl, turtles, and edible plants. Forests supplied timber, fuel, game, nuts, and medicinal materials. Cahokia was not a single isolated dot on that landscape. It was the centre of a much larger human world. Think of it less like one city surrounded by empty countryside, and more like a powerful urban core embedded in a crowded, cultivated region. People living several miles from the central plaza may still have been part of Cahokia's economy, its ceremonial calendar, its political system, or its social networks. They may have farmed outside the core, travelled in for rituals and feasts, delivered goods or labour, traded with visitors, and returned home again. Some lived in communities that were clearly connected to Cahokia but had their own local identities. Archaeologists have identified mound groups and settlements across the American bottom that grew, changed, or were reorganized during Cahokia's rise. Places like the East St. Louis mound group across the river from Cahokia's main centre may have formed part of this wider urban landscape. Other communities lay north and south along the floodplain, connected by movement, kinship, trade, and probably political obligation. The city was not just where the biggest mound stood. The city was a system, but how many people lived in that system? This is where the story becomes more complicated. You will sometimes hear that Cahokia had 20,000 people, sometimes 30,000. Older estimates went even higher, suggesting that the greater Cahokia region may have held as many as 40,000 people at its peak. If those numbers are right, Cahokia would have rivaled or exceeded many towns in medieval Europe, and would have been by a wide margin the largest settlement north of Mesoamerica. But archaeologists do not have a census. They have post holes, house floors, storage pits, burials, pottery fragments, food remains, and layers of soil. From those traces, they try to estimate how many houses existed at the same time, how many people lived in each household, how densely neighbourhoods were occupied, and how long each structure remained standing. That is not easy. A house can be rebuilt in the same place. A neighbourhood can be crowded for one generation and nearly empty the next. Some structures may have been homes, while others were storage buildings, workshops, temples, or meeting places. And the boundaries of Cahokia itself are not obvious. Do you count only the dense central precinct? Do you include nearby villages? Do you include settlements across the Mississippi? Do you count seasonal visitors arriving for ceremonies, trade, or political gatherings? Each answer produces a different number, so scholars debate the exact population. Some favour lower estimates for the central city, perhaps in the range of 10 to 15,000 people at its height. Others argue that when the surrounding settlements of the American bottom are included, the total population may have reached several tens of thousands. What matters most is not finding one magical number. What matters is recognizing the scale. Cahokia was home to thousands of people living close together in an organized landscape of a kind rarely seen elsewhere in North America at the time. There were other important settlements across the continent, of course. The pueblos of the southwest supported large, complex communities. Places such as Chaco Canyon had monumental architecture, long-distance trade, and regional influence centuries before Cahokia's peak. In Mesoamerica, far to the south, cities were much larger still, with stone pyramids, writing systems, markets, and state institutions that had developed over millennia. Cahokia was not the biggest city in the Americas, and it would be misleading to pretend it appeared from nowhere, disconnected from the wider indigenous world. North America already contained sophisticated farmers, traders, builders, astronomers, and political communities. Cahokia was part of that larger story, but north of the great civilizations of Mesoamerica, Cahokia's scale was extraordinary. No other known settlement in the region combined such a large population, such dense occupation, such extensive earthworks, and such broad political influence at exactly this moment. For a period around the 11th and early 12th centuries, Cahokia seems to have stood apart. It was the largest and most powerful centre in its part of the continent. Its design made that power visible. The central plaza created a vast open stage. It was a place where large groups could gather, where ceremonies could unfold, where leaders could appear before crowds, where games, feasts, exchanges, announcements and rituals may have taken place. Open space sounds simple, but a plaza of that size is not empty land. It is organized land. It tells people where the center is. It tells them where to look around. It rose mounds of different sizes and shapes. Some likely supported elite residences or temples. Some may have marked burial places, lineages, sacred histories, or political offices. Some were platforms for buildings that stood above the ordinary houses around them. The mounds transformed the flat floodplain into a landscape of hierarchy. You did not need a written law code to understand the message. Some people lived higher. Some people had access to restricted places. Some people could stand above the crowd. Roads and pathways connected these spaces. One of the most striking was a broad processional route archaeologists call the Rattlesnake Causeway, extending south from the central precinct toward another major mound complex. Its exact use remains debated. It may have carried people during ceremonies. It may have linked different political or sacred districts. But its existence shows that movement through Cahokia was not entirely random. The city had axes, routes, thresholds, and destinations. Neighbourhoods were organised too. Houses were not scattered across the plain without pattern. Many were arranged in groups, sometimes enclosed by fences or boundaries, sometimes clustered around shared open areas. These may have been extended family compounds, communities of migrants from similar places, work groups, or social units tied to particular leaders. Imagine arriving there from a small farming village. You would see the mounds first, rising above the flat horizon, then the fields, then the houses multiplying in every direction. Then people speaking in different accents, wearing different ornaments, carrying goods from places you had never seen. You might smell wood, smoke, cooking maize, fish drying, hides being worked, and fresh earth from another construction project. You might hear ceremonies from the plaza, arguments in crowded lanes, children, dogs, drums, and the constant labour of a city that was still building itself. That is why calling Cahokia a city is useful. It captures density, scale, planning, monumentality, specialised labour, social inequality, the concentration of people and power in one place. But it is also imperfect. The word city can make us imagine city halls, merchants' guilds, police, taxes, stone walls, and written records. Cahokia was not a medieval European town transplanted to Illinois. Its power may have rested as much on ritual as administration. Its neighbourhoods may have been held together by kinship, clan obligations, ceremonies, gift exchange, and sacred authority rather than formal bureaucracy. Cahokia was urban, but it was urban in its own way, and its position at the centre of the American bottom gave that urban system enormous advantages. The floodplain could feed people, the Mississippi and its tributaries could move people and goods. The surrounding bluffs offered timber, stone, clay, and defensible high ground. Travel routes ran north and south along the river valley, east into the Ohio Valley, west toward the plains, and south toward the wider Mississippian world. Cahokia sat where landscapes, waterways, people, and ideas could converge. That made it powerful, but it also made it demanding. A city of this size needed food every day, wood every day, clean water, order, cooperation, labour. It needed a way to turn thousands of separate households into something that could function as one community. And at the centre of that challenge stood the greatest structure Cahokia's people ever built, a mountain of earth that announced to everyone approaching across the floodplain exactly where power lived. That mountain was Monks Mound. Even today, after nearly 1,000 years of rain, erosion, excavation, farming around its edges, and attempts to preserve it, Monks Mound is enormous. It rises roughly 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain. Its base covers more than 14 acres. At its widest, it stretches nearly 1,000 feet from north to south and about 700 feet east to west. This was not a natural hill. It was built layer by layer, basket by basket, generation by generation. Monks Mound is the largest prehistoric earthen structure north of Mesoamerica. More than 15 million cubic feet of earth may have gone into its construction. That is a hard number to picture, so think about what it means in human terms. No bulldozers, no dump trucks, no steel shovels, no draft animals pulling carts loaded with soil. The people of Cahokia had digging sticks, stone hoes, woven baskets, wooden tools, and their own bodies. Workers collected soil from borrow pits, creek banks, low areas, and perhaps specially chosen sources across the landscape. They filled baskets with clay, silt, and darker topsoil. Then they carried those baskets to the mound. They climbed upward. They dumped the earth, they returned, and then they did it again, and again, and again. One basket might hold 30 or 40 pounds of soil. Maybe more, depending on its size and the strength of the person carrying it. To move millions of cubic feet of earth, Cahokia's people may have needed tens of millions of individual basket loads. That is not just construction, that is organisation on a scale that changes what we think a society can do. Someone had to decide where the mound would rise. Someone had to mark its boundaries. Someone had to coordinate workers, provide food, settle disputes, maintain access routes, and make sure the structure kept its intended shape. Families may have contributed labour as part of communal obligations. Allied villages may have sent work parties. Leaders may have organised construction through kinship ties, ritual duties, feasting, gifts, or political pressure. Probably some combination of all of those things, and the mound did not appear all at once. Archaeologists have found that Monks Mound was built in many stages. It began around the time Cahokia was becoming a major centre, probably during or shortly after the explosive growth of the 10th and 11th centuries. But the builders kept changing it. They added new layers, expanded terraces, reshaped slopes, built retaining walls and ramps, repaired damage, covered older surfaces with fresh loads of earth. The monument had a history because the city had a history. Every rebuilding episode may have marked a new political moment, a new leader, a new ceremony, a crisis, an expansion, or an attempt to restore something that had begun to fail. We cannot always tell exactly why one layer was added when it was. Earth does not preserve speeches. It does not tell us who gave the order, but it preserves the physical evidence of repeated decisions. This mound matters enough to build again, and that matters because Monks Mound was not simply a pile of dirt. It was the centre of Cahokia's centre. Its massive platform faced the Grand Plaza, the great open space where crowds could gather below. From the plaza, the mound would have dominated everything. Imagine standing at its base. The floodplain around you is mostly flat. Houses are low. Fences are low. Fields stretch outward toward the horizon. Then, directly ahead, rises a terraced mountain of packed earth, taller than a modern 8-story building. At its summit stood at least one large structure, probably built of wood and thatch. What exactly was it? That is one of the biggest unanswered questions at Cahokia. Some archaeologists think the summit supported the residence of a powerful leader, perhaps a hereditary chief or sacred ruler. Others think it was a temple, council house, ceremonial building, or a structure that combined political and religious authority in ways that would have made no sense to separate. In many ancient societies, the people who governed also claimed a special relationship with ancestors, spirits, the sun, the earth, or the forces that controlled rain and crops. Cahokia may have worked the same way. The structure on top may have been a place where leaders received visitors, conducted ceremonies, stored sacred objects, hosted feasts, or made decisions that affected thousands of people below. It may have been visible from far across the plaza, a building lifted above all other buildings, reached by a controlled ascent, separated from ordinary life by height and distance. But we should be careful. Wood rots, thatch disappears. Walls collapse into soil. The summit has been altered by centuries of erosion and later activity. Archaeologists have found traces of buildings and post holes, but they cannot reconstruct every phase with certainty. We do not know the exact shape of the final summit building. We do not know who was allowed inside. We do not know whether one person ruled from that height, a council gathered there, or different groups used it at different times. What we know is that access was not equal. You could see the summit from below, but you could not simply be there. That is architecture doing political work. A monument can make an idea feel permanent. It can turn hierarchy into part of the landscape. It can tell every visitor, every farmer, every child growing up in the city, there is a centre here. There are people closer to that centre than you are. There are places above you literally and symbolically, And Cahokia had many mounds, not just one. Some were broad, flat-topped platforms, probably built to hold temples, elite residences, meeting houses, or ceremonial structures. Others were conical burial mounds, places where the dead may have been placed, remembered, and connected to stories of lineage and authority. Some mounds may have marked important events. Some may have been rebuilt around earlier structures or earlier burials, physically layering the present over the past. A mound could be a stage, a shrine, a home, a tomb, a political office, and a memory all at once. That is why calling these structures pyramids can be misleading, even if the comparison helps communicate their scale. Cahokia's mounds were not stone copies of Egypt or Mesoamerica. They belonged to a deep indigenous tradition of earthwork building in eastern North America. For thousands of years before Cahokia, communities had raised burial mounds, ceremonial enclosures, platform mounds, and great geometric earthworks. But Cahokia took that tradition to another level. It concentrated labour, ritual, and authority into a monumental landscape, larger than anything the region had seen. And monument building can do something powerful to a community. It can unite people. Imagine hundreds of workers arriving from different neighbourhoods and villages. They carry soil together. They eat together. They take part in ceremonies marking a new construction phase. They see their own labour becoming something visible, something that will outlast them. A massive public project can create shared identity. It can make people feel that they belong to something larger than a household or a village. But it can also reinforce who gives the orders. Not everyone decides where a mound goes. Not everyone chooses what stands on top. Not everyone gets to live above the plaza while others carry baskets uphill. That is the double edge of monuments. They create solidarity, but they can also make inequality seem natural. If power is built into the landscape, then power can begin to feel as old and solid as the earth itself. Except Monks Mound was never as solid as it looked. Earth is difficult to control, especially in a place with heavy rain, seasonal flooding, humidity, and changing temperatures. The builders had to work with different soils, some more stable than others. They created layers of clay and packed fill. They shaped terraces and slopes. In some areas they used retaining features to hold the mound together. But water kept finding weak points. Archaeologists have identified signs of slumping, erosion, and repairs. Parts of the mound's slopes failed. Sections had to be rebuilt. New earth was added to stabilize old surfaces. What looked from a distance like an eternal mountain was actually a structure requiring constant attention. That may be one of the most revealing things about Monks Mound. Cahokia's power was impressive. It was visible. It was organized. It could move mountains of soil with human hands. But it was also expensive to maintain. The mound needed labour long after its first construction. The plaza needed upkeep. Buildings needed replacement. Timber had to be cut. Food had to be grown. Ceremonies had to be performed. Obligations had to be honoured. A city built on cooperation had to keep producing cooperation, year after year. Even when harvests were poor, leaders were challenged or communities began asking whether the burden was worth it. For a time, Cahokia's people made it work. They built a mountain in the middle of a floodplain. And then they looked beyond the earth beneath their feet, toward the sky above it. And they looked beyond the earth beneath their feet toward the sky above it. West of Monks Mound, beyond the Grand Plaza, archaeologists found the traces of something that had once stood upright against the horizon. Circles of giant wooden posts. Today, these structures are known as Cahokia's woodhenges. The name is modern, borrowed from Stonehenge in England, but the comparison is useful in one very specific way. Like Stonehenge, these timber circles appear to have helped people mark the movement of the sun across the year. They were not made of stone. They were made of massive tree trunks, probably red cedar, set deep into the ground in carefully measured rings. The posts may have stood 15 to 20 feet tall. From a distance, a completed circle would have looked like a wall of upright timber rising from the flat prairie. And there was not just one. Archaeologists have identified evidence for several different timber circles, built, altered, and rebuilt over time. Some were smaller, later ones were larger. At least one of the best documented circles had 48 posts arranged around a central observation point. That number was not random, neither was the placement. Stand at the centre of one of these circles at sunrise, and certain posts lined up with the sun on key dates of the year. One marked the sunrise around the summer solstice, when the sun reaches its northernmost point on the horizon and the days are longest. Another marked the winter solstice, when sunrise shifts far to the south and daylight is shortest. Other alignments appear to have indicated the spring and fall equinoxes, the points when day and night are nearly equal. This is the well-supported part of the story. The posts were arranged in ways that correspond closely with solar events. The alignments are too consistent and too useful to dismiss as accident. Cahokia's people were watching the sky. They knew where the sun rose at different times of year. They built large public structures that made those movements visible. But why? At the most practical level, a solar calendar matters to farming. The Mississippi Valley does not give food freely. Corn must be planted at the right time. Fields have to be prepared. Seeds must go into the ground after the danger of severe cold has passed, but early enough to take advantage of the growing season. Harvest has to happen before weather turns. Wood must be gathered. Food must be dried and stored. Hunting patterns change. River conditions change. The entire rhythm of life changes. For a city as large as Cahokia, timing was not a small concern. It was survival. If you are feeding thousands of people, you cannot rely on vague impressions that spring feels close. You need shared signals. You need a way for different households, neighborhoods, and surrounding villages to recognize that a seasonal threshold has arrived. The sun could provide that signal. Imagine the winter solstice, the coldest, darkest part of the year. Stored food is being eaten. Fields lie empty. Days have been getting shorter for months. Then at dawn the sun rises in exactly the place marked by one of the great posts. The people watching would know something important. The sun has reached its turning point. The light will begin returning. That is astronomy. But it is also ceremony, and at Cahokia, ceremony was probably never completely separate from politics, farming, or social order. A leader who could stand at the centre of the circle, identify the turning of the year, oversee the rites, and announce the proper time for communal action, was doing more than reading a calendar. They were helping organize the world. This does not mean Cahokia had a single priest-king personally controlling every sunrise. We do not have evidence for that. Archaeology does not give us names, speeches, or a written manual explaining who stood in the circle and what they said. But the scale of the construction tells us these observations mattered publicly. A household can watch the horizon on its own. A farmer can notice the seasons without erecting dozens of cedar posts. Building a huge timber circle took planning, labour, knowledge, and coordination. Trees had to be selected, cut, transported, shaped, and planted. The circle had to be laid out with remarkable precision. And because wood decays, it had to be renewed. That turns seasonal knowledge into a civic event. The calendar was not hidden in the mind of one observer. It was built into the landscape where people could gather around it. And the location may be just as important as the alignments themselves. From the Woodhenge area, the eastern horizon held special meaning. At certain times of year, the rising sun appears in line with Cahokia's monumental core. Some solar alignments seem to connect the observer, the dawn, and Monks Mound itself. At the equinox, the sun may have risen in a position that visually associated it with the Great Mound and the plaza beyond. That connection is difficult to ignore. Cahokia's most powerful monument stood to the east. The sun rose in the east. The daily rebirth of light unfolded in the same direction as the city's sacred and political centre. For many indigenous societies of eastern North America, the east was associated with beginnings, life, renewal, and the arrival of the sun. It is reasonable to think that Cahokia's builders also saw deep meaning in that direction. The city was not simply laid out for convenience. Its mounds, plazas, processional spaces, and sightlines may have created a landscape where cosmic order and human order reflected each other. The sun rises, the mound stands, the people gather. The world continues because the proper ceremonies are observed, the proper obligations are fulfilled, and the community remains in balance. That is a possible interpretation, but it is important to separate what we know from what we imagine. We know the timber circles existed. We know their posts were deliberately arranged. We know several alignments correspond with solstice and equinox sunrises. We know Cahokia's central precinct was organised around enormous public spaces and monuments. What we do not know is the exact mythology attached to every alignment. We do not know whether each post represented a specific spirit, clan, ancestor, or celestial being. We do not know the words spoken at dawn. We do not know whether ordinary residents watched from outside the circle, whether only certain ritual specialists entered, or whether ceremonies changed from one generation to the next. And we should not pretend otherwise. The temptation is to turn Woodhenge into a machine that explains everything. A perfect ancient observatory, a secret code in the ground. But Cahokia was more complicated than that. These circles were probably not scientific instruments in the modern sense, built only to collect astronomical data. They were instruments of meaning. They transformed the movement of the sun into something a whole city could witness. They linked planting and harvesting to public ritual. They gave ceremonies a schedule. They gave leaders opportunities to demonstrate knowledge, authority, and their connection to forces larger than any individual household. A civic calendar can hold a city together. It tells people when to gather, when to feast, when to mourn, when to begin planting, when to renew alliances, when to conduct ceremonies for the dead, for the crops, for the returning sun. In a settlement spread across neighbourhoods, farms, mound precincts, and nearby villages, those shared dates could create a common rhythm. Cahokia was not just a collection of houses around a mound. It was a population learning to live on the same clock, and that clock was written across the horizon. Every year the sun drifted northward at sunrise. Every year it paused at the summer solstice and began moving back. Every year it reached the equinoxes. Every year it slid southward again toward winter. For generations, people at Cahokia may have watched those movements from circles of cedar posts. They watched the sky tell them when to plant. They watched it tell them when to gather. They watched it tell them that order still existed. But a calendar can only coordinate a society if the society has enough food, labour, trust, and shared belief to follow it. The Woodhenges reveal a city capable of turning time itself into public ceremony. The houses around them reveal what that achievement meant in daily life. Beyond the mounds, beyond the plazas, beyond the great cedar circles that turned sunrise into ceremony, Cahokia was a city of homes, thousands of them. Most Cahokians did not live on top of Monks Mound. They did not spend every day watching solstices or taking part in public rituals. They woke up in houses built from timber poles, woven walls, clay plaster, and thatched roofs. They cooked, they repaired tools, they carried water. They cared for children. They planted corn. They worried about winter stores. They buried relatives. They argued with neighbours. They did the ordinary work that makes any city possible. Archaeologists find these lives indirectly, a dark stain in the soil where a wooden wall once stood, post holes marking the outline of a house, hearths blackened by repeated fires, storage pits filled with ash, broken pottery, animal bone, and discarded food. A cluster of structures arranged around an open yard. The wood is gone, the roofs are gone, the people are gone, but the ground still remembers where they lived. Many Cahokian houses were probably rectangular, built with walls of upright posts covered in wattle and daub. That means a lattice of branches was woven between the posts, then coated with clay. The result was not a flimsy shelter. Properly maintained, these were solid buildings, warm enough for winter, cool enough in summer, and made from materials available across the Mississippi floodplain. Inside, a family might sleep beside a central hearth. Fire provided heat, light, and a place to cook. It also filled the house with smoke, which may have helped preserve food hanging overhead and kept some insects away. Pots sat near the flames. Baskets held dried corn, seeds, nuts, and other supplies. Tools of bone, stone, shell, and wood were stored where they could be reached quickly. Outside, the household continued. There may have been gardens close to the houses. Workspaces where people chipped stone or shaped pottery. Racks for drying meat, fish, and squash. Pits dug into the earth for storage. Refuse areas that, 1,000 years later, would become some of the richest sources of evidence archaeologists have. Trash is history's diary. Every broken pot, burned seed, fish bone, and discarded tool fragment tells us something about what people ate, made, traded, and threw away without imagining anyone would ever care. And the diet that emerges from those remains was varied, even if maize stood at its centre. Corn was the engine of Cahokia. It could produce large amounts of food from relatively small plots. It could be dried and stored for months, ground into meal, boiled into porridge, baked into cakes, or mixed with other foods. It gave a growing population a dependable source of calories. Without maize agriculture, Cahokia probably could not have reached anything like its extraordinary size. But people did not live on corn alone. Beans added protein. Squash provided flesh, seeds, and durable rinds that could be used as containers. Together, maize, beans, and squash formed a powerful agricultural system. Corn gave the bean vines something to climb. Beans helped return nitrogen to the soil. Squash leaves shaded the ground, helping hold moisture and suppress weeds. It was not just farming, it was ecological knowledge accumulated over generations. Cahokians also gathered wild plants from woods, wetlands, and prairies. Nuts, fruits, seeds, greens, and tubers added variety to household meals. Fish came from the Mississippi, nearby streams, lakes, and sloughs. Deer were hunted, so were smaller animals including turtles, birds, and waterfowl. The floodplain itself was a giant pantry, if you knew where to look and when to look. That matters because Cahokia was not isolated from nature. It was built inside one of North America's richest river landscapes. Its people depended on cultivated fields, yes, but also on seasonal runs of fish, forests full of game, wetlands alive with birds and wild food sources that could help, when crops failed or stores ran low. Then there was the work of making things. A city needs containers. It needs cutting tools, digging tools, clothing, ornaments, weapons, and objects for ceremony. It needs people who know how to turn raw materials into useful things. Cahokian potters shaped clay into jars, bowls, and cooking vessels. Some were plain and practical, made for everyday use. Others carried incised designs, stamped patterns, or carefully formed rims. These were not factory products. Each vessel reflects choices: what clay to use, how to temper it so it would not crack in the fire, how thick to make the walls, how to shape it for cooking or serving. Stone workers made arrow points, scrapers, drills, hoes, and blades. Some materials came from local sources, others travelled long distances through exchange networks. Shell workers shaped marine shell into beads, cups, and ornaments. Copper was hammered into thin sheets and transformed into symbols of status and ceremony. Textiles almost never survive in the wet soils of the Mississippi Valley, but tools such as spindle whorls and bone needles suggest spinning, weaving, and sewing were important parts of daily production. Imagine how much labour that represents. No storehouses, no hardware shops, no delivery carts arriving with replacement tools. If a pot cracked, someone made another. If a roof leaked, someone repaired it. If clothing wore out, fibres had to be gathered, spun, woven, and sewn. If a field needed clearing, trees were cut with stone axes and burned. If a household needed food for winter, it had to be grown, hunted, gathered, processed, and stored before cold weather arrived. Urban life did not free Cahokians from practical work. It multiplied the need for it, and who did that work? This is where archaeology reaches one of its limits. We can identify tasks, we can study skeletons for signs of repeated strain. We can examine tools, burials, house patterns, and food remains. But we cannot simply look at an object and declare that men used it, women made it, elders controlled it, or children were excluded. Those categories can be real and important, but the exact division of labour at Cahokia is not written down for us. What is likely is that households depended on people of different ages and abilities. Children learned by watching and doing. Older people carried knowledge about planting, food preservation, medicines, kinship, and ritual. Adults performed demanding labour in fields, construction sites, workshops, hunting grounds, and homes. Kinship networks probably mattered enormously, linking households through marriage, obligation, shared ancestry, and mutual aid. A city this large could not run on strangers acting alone. It needed trust. It needed people who would help build a house, share food after a bad harvest, care for children, join work parties, and honour obligations that reached beyond one household wall. But density brought problems too. Cahokia's growth packed more people, animals, food waste, fires, and latrines into a limited area. Water had to be collected and kept clean. Refuse had to go somewhere. Human waste, spoiled food, and standing water could create conditions where parasites and infectious disease spread more easily than they would in scattered farming villages. We should be careful here. Archaeologists cannot reconstruct every outbreak or sanitation practice. Cahokia was not a modern city with sewers, but neither were its people helpless. Communities can manage waste, move households, use designated disposal areas, and draw on deep practical knowledge of water and landscape. Still, crowding changes the equation. A sickness that might burn out in an isolated hamlet can move through a dense settlement. A poor harvest becomes more dangerous when thousands depend on the same food system. A contaminated water source affects more than one family. The very concentration of people that made Cahokia powerful may also have made it vulnerable. That tension was built into everyday life. Every morning people stepped out of their houses into a city unlike anything most of North America had seen. Monumental mounds rose in the distance. Public ceremonies marked the turning of the year. Leaders may have claimed the power to connect earth, sky, ancestors, and harvest, but the city survived one meal at a time, one repaired roof, one planted field, one fired pot, one shared store of corn. And as Cahokia grew, those ordinary systems had to support something increasingly extraordinary, a society where not everyone carried the same burdens, ate the same food, or held the same power. Not everyone carried the same burdens, ate the same food, or held the same power. Cahokia was a city, but it was not an equal city. The landscape itself hints at that difference. Monks Mound dominated the centre, rising above neighbourhoods, plazas, and smaller mounds. Its position was not accidental. To stand on top of that enormous platform was to look down across the city. To climb toward it was to move through a landscape designed to make rank visible. Some people lived close to these ceremonial centres. Some were buried in or near mounds. Some were associated with rare materials brought from far beyond the Mississippi Valley, copper from the Great Lakes region, marine shell from the Gulf Coast, finely worked stone from distant quarries, and ornaments that required extraordinary skill and time to produce. Most people were not. Most people lived in ordinary houses. They worked fields, gathered fuel, made pottery, processed food, repaired buildings, raised children, and answered the endless practical demands of urban life. That difference does not automatically mean Cahokia had kings in the modern sense. Archaeology cannot give us a list of royal names, a palace archive, or a written constitution explaining who was in charge. But it does suggest hierarchy. Some individuals, families, or religious offices held access to power that others did not. They may have controlled ceremonies, organised labour, directed trade, managed food stores, or claimed special relationships with ancestors and the forces that governed the sky, rain, fertility, and death. And in a city built from earth and timber, the ability to organise people may have been the greatest form of power of all. Think about Monks Mound again. Its construction required millions of basket loads of soil. Not one giant load delivered in a single moment, but countless trips. Someone had to dig the earth. Someone had to fill baskets. Someone had to carry them. Someone had to decide where each layer went. Someone had to provide food and water for workers. Someone had to coordinate the effort across seasons, perhaps generations. You do not build a monument like that by asking a few neighbours for a favour. You need authority, or persuasion, or both. Leaders may have called on kinship obligations, religious duty, seasonal work parties, and public feasts. A household might contribute labour because it owed service to a local leader. A village might send food, crafts, or workers as tribute. People may have joined willingly because ceremonies brought meaning, community, protection, and access to valuable alliances. But willingness and pressure can exist at the same time. That is one of the difficult truths of unequal societies. A great public project can be sacred. It can create unity. It can feed workers and strengthen bonds between communities. And it can still place its heaviest costs on people with the least power to refuse. The clearest and most unsettling evidence for Cahokia's social differences comes from a place archaeologists call Mound 72. Mound 72 was not as massive as Monks Mound. From the outside, it might seem almost modest, but beneath it, archaeologists uncovered a complex sequence of burials. Not one grave, not one moment, a series of deposits and episodes that unfolded over time. Among them was a burial of a high-status man, placed on a bed of thousands of marine shell beads. The beads had been arranged in the shape of what may have been a bird, perhaps connected to powerful symbols of warfare, the sky, or the upper world. Nearby were other individuals, including people buried with finely made objects and others whose positions suggest they were part of carefully staged ritual events. For years, the story was often told in blunt, dramatic terms. A ruler dies, retainers are sacrificed. Young women are killed and buried around him. Cahokia becomes a kingdom ruled through terror. It is a gripping story. It is also too simple. The remains at Mound 72 are real. The scale of the burials is real. Some deposits do appear to include people who may have died violently or been killed as part of ritual, but the exact meaning of every burial is debated. Later analysis has complicated earlier interpretations. Individuals grouped together may not all have been young women, for example. Their ages, sexes, health, relationships, and causes of death do not always fit the neat story people want to tell. And that matters, because these were not props in an ancient drama. They were human beings with lives we can only partly recover. Some may have been captives, some may have been political followers. Some may have held status of their own. Some could have died from disease or other causes before being included in a larger ceremony. Some may indeed have been sacrificed. The evidence does not let us flatten them into one category. What Mound 72 tells us with more confidence is that death at Cahokia could be public, political, and deeply ceremonial. Burial was not only about mourning, it could announce rank. It could connect the dead to cosmic symbols. It could create obligations among the living. It could show who belonged at the centre of power and who did not. That is how hierarchy works, not only through force but through stories. A leader who can claim connection to the sun, the ancestors, or the cycles of planting and harvest does not need to explain power in ordinary terms. Their authority becomes part of the structure of the universe. The mound is high because the world has order. The ceremony must happen because the seasons depend on it. The labour must be given because everyone benefits when the sacred balance holds. Maybe that is what Cahokia's leaders offered, a system that made a vast, changing world feel organised. Feasts may have been central to that system. Food was more than survival. A leader who could provide maize, meat, drink, and ritual gifts could turn abundance into loyalty. Large gatherings allowed people from scattered communities to meet, trade, marry, make alliances, and participate in ceremonies that bound them to Cahokia's centre. But feasts require surplus. Surplus requires fields, workers, storage, and good harvests. And every new mound, palisade, plaza, or ceremonial gathering increased the demands on the people producing that surplus. At first, Cahokia's hierarchy may have helped make its explosive growth possible. Leaders coordinated construction. Rituals drew communities together. Exchange networks brought rare materials and prestige. Public works gave people a shared identity, not just residents of separate villages, but participants in something enormous. But success has a cost. As the city grew, more people had to be fed. More wood had to be cut. More fields had to be planted. More labour had to be organised. More promises had to be kept. And when a society is built on unequal obligations, the question is never just whether leaders can command. It is whether ordinary people still believe the bargain is worth it. And part of that bargain was connection. Cahokia did not become powerful because it sat alone in a fertile floodplain and grew maize. Plenty of communities grew maize. Plenty of communities built villages beside rivers. Cahokia became something different because it turned itself into a centre. A place where goods, people, beliefs and obligations flowed in from far beyond the city itself. Archaeologists can trace some of those connections through the things Cahokians left behind. Marine shell arrived from the Gulf Coast, hundreds of miles to the south. Not just ordinary shells washed up along a riverbank, but materials from saltwater worlds most people in the Mississippi Valley would never see. Those shells were cut, drilled, polished, and transformed into beads, cups, gorgets, and ornaments. Copper came from the Great Lakes region to the north, where people could obtain and work native copper from sources far beyond Cahokia's local landscape. Stone for particular tools and ceremonial objects came from distant quarries. Exotic pigments, rare minerals, and carefully crafted goods moved through the same broad web of exchange. Imagine what that meant. A person living near Cahokia could wear an ornament made from the remains of an animal that lived in the Gulf of Mexico. They could see a copper object whose raw material began near Lake Superior. They could take part in a ceremony using materials gathered from landscapes hundreds of miles away, places known through travellers, stories, marriage ties, and generations of exchange. For us, that sounds like trade, and it was trade, at least in part. But calling it trade can make it sound too familiar, like Cahokia had merchants with price lists, warehouses, and coinage. This was something more personal and more political. Goods may have moved as gifts between allied leaders. They may have been exchanged at seasonal gatherings. They may have travelled with families moving between communities, with pilgrims coming to ceremonies, or with craft specialists carrying their knowledge as well as their products. A shell bead was valuable because it was beautiful and difficult to obtain. But it was also valuable because it carried a story. It proved that someone had connections. It showed that a leader, family, or ceremonial community could reach beyond the horizon. In a world without written contracts, distant goods could become evidence of trust. If you could obtain copper from the north, shell from the south, and stone from far away, you were not just rich. You were plugged into a network. You had allies. You had obligations. You had people who would recognize your authority, or at least your importance, in places most ordinary villagers would never visit. And Cahokia seems to have been a place where those networks converged. But here we need to be careful. The presence of far-flung materials does not prove Cahokia ruled every region they came from. Archaeologists do not have evidence of a Cahokian empire stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, with governors, armies, and tax collectors enforcing orders across half a continent. That is not how influence has to work. Think of it like a fire in the dark. The flames are in one place, but the light reaches much farther. Cahokia may have directly controlled some nearby communities. It may have drawn labour, food, and tribute from villages across the American bottom and surrounding regions. But farther away, its power may have been less like command and more like attraction. People came because the city was a place of ceremony, a place of exchange, a place where new ideas had status, a place where ambitious leaders could make alliances, acquire prestige goods, and return home with proof that they had been to the centre of something enormous. And they did return home, carrying more than shell and copper. Across parts of the Midwest and Southeast, archaeologists find objects, symbols, building practices, and ceremonial traditions that resemble those seen at Cahokia or seem connected to the wider world Cahokia helped create. Platform mounds began appearing in many places. Large plazas became more important. Communities reorganized around ceremonial centers. Maize agriculture expanded. New styles of pottery, ornaments, and ritual art circulated through the river valleys and forests of eastern North America. This was the emergence of what archaeologists call the Mississippian world. Not one nation, not one people, not one government with a single capital. A world of related traditions. Different societies adopted these practices in their own ways. Some built mound centers that may have been inspired by Cahokia. Some developed their own local styles of leadership and ceremony. Some participated in exchange networks without becoming Cahokian copies. Others may have resisted the influence of the great city entirely. Cultures do not spread like paint poured across a map. They are selected, reshaped, argued over, and made local. But the pattern is hard to ignore. After Cahokia's rise, more communities across the eastern woodlands began building landscapes of mounds, plazas, palisades, and ceremonial spaces. Images connected to birds, warriors, ancestors, the sky, fertility, death, and cosmic balance appear across a huge region. Archaeologists sometimes group parts of this symbolic world under names like the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. The name can sound technical. The underlying idea is simple. People across vast distances were beginning to use some of the same sacred vocabulary. A bird image in one place may not have meant exactly what it meant in another. A copper plate, shell gorget, or carved stone object could have different meanings depending on who wore it and where. But the repeated themes suggest communication, shared stories, shared rituals, shared ideas about how the universe was organized and who had the right to stand at its center. That is where pilgrimage may come in. Cahokia had massive plazas. It had monuments on a scale few people in North America had ever encountered. It had Woodhenge circles marking solar events. It had elite burials, public rituals, feasts, markets, and neighborhoods filled with people from different backgrounds. It had all the ingredients of a place that could pull visitors toward it, not just for practical exchange, but for spiritual reasons. Maybe people traveled to Cahokia to witness ceremonies tied to the sun and agricultural calendar. Maybe they came to bury important dead near sacred places. Maybe they came seeking marriage partners, political alliances, healing, protection, or access to ritual knowledge. Maybe they came because being present at Cahokia, standing before Monks Mound among thousands of other people, made the world feel larger and more ordered than it did at home. We cannot interview those pilgrims. We cannot read a sign saying, "Welcome to Cahokia, sacred center of the Mississippi Valley." But the city's scale makes more sense if it was serving more than its permanent residents. A city of perhaps many thousands needed visitors. It needed allies. It needed people arriving with goods, food, labor, and news. It needed outside communities to believe that Cahokia mattered. The rare materials entering the city were not luxuries floating above ordinary life. They helped leaders stage ceremonies, reward supporters, display sacred connections, and make power visible. And the influence flowing back outward mattered just as much. If leaders in distant communities adopted Cahokian-style symbols, traded with Cahokian-connected networks, or sent people to Cahokia for ceremonies, they were helping sustain the city's reputation. Every traveller who returned home with a shell ornament, a new ritual practice, or a story about the giant mound added another thread to Cahokia's web. That web was one of the city's greatest strengths. It could bring in resources from far away. It could spread ideas faster than people could travel. It could turn one settlement in a floodplain into a place with continental importance. But networks are not just sources of wealth, they are promises. A leader promises access to distant goods. A ceremonial centre promises that the seasons will remain in balance. A city promises protection, opportunity, meaning, and connection to a world larger than any one village. And once thousands of people begin depending on those promises, failure does not stay local. If trade routes weaken, if pilgrims stop coming, if distant allies find another centre, Cahokia loses more than shell, copper, and stone. It loses the evidence that it still stands at the centre of the world. But a city that claims to stand at the centre of the world has to answer one brutal question. What happens when someone wants in? Or worse, what happens when someone inside decides they no longer believe in the people at the centre? At some point in Cahokia's history, its leaders built a barrier around the central ceremonial precinct. Archaeologists call it the Palisade. It was not a symbolic line scratched in the dirt. It was a major wooden fortification, probably enclosing Monks Mound, the Grand Plaza, and other important mounds and buildings in the city's core. The wall appears to have been made from thousands of huge wooden posts, set tightly side by side in a deep trench. Estimates vary, but it may have required something like 15,000 to 20,000 trees. Imagine what that means in practical terms. Trees had to be selected, cut down with stone tools, stripped, hauled across the landscape, placed upright and secured into the ground. Then the wall had to be maintained against rot, storms, shifting soil and fire. This was not a weekend project. It was one of the largest collective construction efforts Cahokia ever attempted. And the wall was not simply a straight fence. At intervals along the palisade were projecting structures usually called bastions. These extensions would have allowed people inside the wall to look along its outer face. If attackers approached, defenders could potentially watch the wall from multiple angles rather than standing blind behind a flat barrier. That detail matters. A palisade with bastions looks defensive because it almost certainly had defensive possibilities. It could have made raids more difficult. It could have slowed an attacking group. It could have protected the people, buildings and sacred spaces inside Cahokia's political heart. And it appears the wall was rebuilt more than once. Archaeologists have found evidence that sections of the palisade were replaced or renewed several times. That means Cahokia's leaders did not build it, admire it, and forget about it. Generations of people invested more labour in keeping it standing. They continued to define a protected interior and an unprotected exterior. They continued to make the central precinct physically different from the rest of the city. So, was Cahokia under attack? Maybe, but this is where the story gets complicated. A wall is evidence of concern. It is not automatic proof of constant war. People build barriers for many reasons. A palisade can keep enemies out, but it can also control who gets in. It can mark a sacred boundary. It can separate elite compounds from ordinary neighbourhoods. It can direct visitors towards specific entrances where guards, officials, ritual specialists or leaders can decide who enters and under what conditions. Think about the message the wall sent. Outside stood the crowded neighbourhoods. The homes, workshops, markets, fields, travellers, migrants and visitors. Inside stood the great mound, the central plaza, and the places where power was performed. The palisade said that this space was different. Not everyone could simply walk into it. Not every gathering was open. Not every ceremony was for every person. It turned authority into architecture. A person approaching Cahokia's centre would not just see Monks Mound rising above the floodplain. They would encounter a boundary of timber, a visible reminder that access to power was controlled. That could be about security. It could also be about theatre. Rulers everywhere have understood this. Gates, walls, guards, restricted courtyards and elevated platforms all create distance between ordinary people and those who claim special status. The harder it is to reach the centre, the more important the centre can seem. But even symbolic walls need real labour, and that labour came at a cost. Cahokia already needed wood for houses, temples, cooking fires, storage structures, tools, and the giant construction projects that reshaped the city. A palisade demanded timber on an industrial scale. Rebuilding it demanded even more. As nearby forests were cut back, workers may have had to travel farther for suitable trees. That meant more time, more hauling, more people pulled away from farming, hunting, craft work and family life. Every replacement post represented another tree that had to be found, another burden that had to be organised, another reminder that maintaining the city's centre was not free. And if the wall was built because people feared violence, that raises another question. What kind of violence? The broader region was not a peaceful world untouched by conflict. Archaeological evidence from parts of the Mississippi Valley in eastern North America shows that communities sometimes fortified settlements. Human remains from different sites and periods can carry signs of injury, healed fractures, embedded projectile points, cut marks and wounds that did not heal. Raiding revenge attacks, competition over land, and struggles between rival communities were all possible in a world where food stores, trade routes, prestige goods, and sacred authority could become sources of conflict. But the evidence does not let us reduce Cahokia to one simple story of armies attacking armies. Much violence in small-scale societies can be episodic. A raid may involve a few dozen people, not thousands. Conflict may erupt over a particular insult, a failed alliance, a disputed marriage, a killing, or access to a valuable place. Some threats may come from outside groups. Others may come from people who once lived within the same political network. And that possibility is especially important at Cahokia. A city built by drawing people together also creates new tensions. Different communities had to share land, food, water, labour, ritual spaces, and political authority. Some people may have prospered, others may have felt exploited. Some leaders may have gained access to prestige goods and sacred influence. Others may have watched from outside the wall. A palisade can protect against raiders. It can also protect a ruling centre from its own population. We cannot prove that Cahokia's wall was built to suppress internal unrest. The archaeology does not give us a written account of angry farmers marching on Monks Mound. But the possibility belongs on the table. Large, unequal societies do not need foreign enemies to feel insecure. Sometimes the danger comes from the gap between what leaders promise and what ordinary people experience. Remember what Cahokia had promised: protection, order, access to powerful networks, ceremonies that tied the city to the sun, the seasons, ancestors, and the wider cosmos. A massive wall may have reassured people that the centre was secure. But it may also have revealed that security was no longer taken for granted. That does not mean the palisade marks the beginning of Cahokia's collapse. The city continued. People continued building, farming, trading, and gathering. But the wall is one of those clues that changes the mood of the story. For generations, Cahokia had expanded outward, pulling people and resources toward its centre. Now, at least part of that centre was closing itself behind timber walls. And when a society starts spending enormous effort defending, controlling, and maintaining its core, it may be telling us something important. The pressure was building, but pressure does not always announce itself with a final battle, a burning temple, or a population fleeing in a single terrifying night. Sometimes a city begins to unravel in ways that are almost invisible at first. A house is not rebuilt. A neighbourhood has fewer cooking fires. A ceremonial platform that once received fresh layers of earth is left unchanged. A plaza that once drew crowds from across the region becomes a little quieter every generation. That is the kind of evidence archaeologists see at Cahokia after its peak. The city did not simply switch off. There was no single morning when everyone woke up, looked at Monks Mound, and decided to leave forever. Cahokia's decline appears to have been a process, uneven, complicated, and stretched across generations. Some places may have emptied early, others remained occupied. Some ceremonies continued, some mounds were maintained. Some families may have stayed in the region for centuries after the city's political centre had lost much of its power. That makes the mystery harder, not easier, because a slow decline leaves no single culprit standing at the scene. Cahokia reached its greatest size sometime after its explosive growth around 1050 AD. At its height, the central precinct and surrounding settlements contained a population that may have numbered in the tens of thousands across the broader urban area. It was larger than any other known city north of Mexico at the time. A place of mounds, plazas, woodhenge circles, crowded neighbourhoods, fields, markets, ritual gatherings and leaders claiming access to powers beyond ordinary life. But by the 1100s and especially into the 1200s, the archaeological pattern begins to change. Construction activity seems to slow in some parts of the city. Not everywhere. not all at once. But the enormous momentum that created Cahokia's monumental landscape was no longer moving with the same force. That matters because monuments are not just piles of dirt. They are political statements. Every expansion of a mound required organisers who could command labour. Every rebuilt temple required people willing, or compelled, to bring timber, clay, food and tools. Every public ceremony required a crowd that still believed showing up mattered. When investment in those activities becomes less consistent, it may mean the people at the centre no longer had the same ability to mobilise everyone around them. Or it may mean people had more urgent things to do. If harvests became uncertain, labour that once went into ceremonies might have gone into clearing new fields, repairing homes, gathering firewood, or simply finding enough food to survive the year. If conflict was becoming more common, families may have focused on local defences rather than distant public projects. If the old religious calendar no longer seemed to guarantee prosperity, fewer people may have felt obligated to support the rituals that once held the city together. And then there are the neighbourhoods. Cahokia was never one perfectly uniform city. It was a patchwork of districts, compounds, craft areas, farmsteads and ceremonial spaces. Different communities may have had different histories, different leaders, and different reasons for living there. So when decline began, it probably did not affect every part of the city equally. Some residential areas show signs of reduced occupation. Houses were abandoned and not replaced. Dense clusters of homes became thinner. Activity shifted away from certain zones. This does not necessarily mean disaster struck every household. People may have moved to other neighbourhoods, returned to smaller villages, joined kin elsewhere, or relocated to places where land and resources were easier to manage. But over time, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The great urban concentration was loosening. Think about what that means. Cahokia's power came partly from bringing people together. The city was a machine for concentrating labour, belief, food, trade and authority in one extraordinary place. If people began leaving that machine, or participating in it less intensely, the whole system changed. A ruler can still stand on a mound, a temple can still hold ceremonies, a palisade can still surround the sacred core. But if fewer people are bringing food, hauling wood, rebuilding houses, attending gatherings, and accepting demands from the centre, then the symbols of power become harder to maintain. This is where political fragmentation may enter the story. We do not have Cahokia's written records, no surviving council minutes. No royal proclamations, no angry letters from farmers saying they were done supplying the elite. Archaeologists have to read politics through things: where people lived, what they built, what they stopped building, how styles changed, where trade goods went, and whether communities continued to orient their lives around the old centre. When a powerful city fragments, material evidence can become more local. Communities may begin emphasizing their own traditions rather than copying the styles of the capital. Leaders outside the central precinct may gain more independence. Exchange networks may redirect toward new centres. Ceremonial life may become less unified. Instead of one great system pulling everyone toward Cahokia, multiple smaller systems may begin competing for people, prestige and resources. That does not require a civil war. Political authority can weaken quietly. An outlying community might still respect Cahokia's sacred past while refusing to send as much labour. A local leader might adopt some Cahokian symbols while building his own following. A family that once migrated into the city might decide the old village offers more security than the crowded floodplain. Over decades, thousands of choices like that can drain power from a centre without anyone ever declaring that the empire is over. And it is important to separate the shrinking of Cahokia's core from the fate of the entire region. The Mississippi Valley did not become empty. people did not vanish from North America. The mounds did not become a blank space on the map overnight. Communities continued living across the region, farming, trading, building, adapting, and carrying traditions forward. Some may have been descendants of Cahokians. Others may have maintained ties to the old city even after its central precinct declined. The fall of an urban centre is not the disappearance of a people. It is a reorganization of life. That distinction is crucial. If Cahokia was losing residents, losing labour, and losing political unity, why? Was it conflict, environmental change, exhausted soils, disease, food shortages, a crisis of faith, pressure from all of them at once? If you enjoy mysteries where the evidence has to be assembled piece by piece, you can get the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries through the website. The link is in the description, because Cahokia's mystery is exactly that kind of puzzle. The first signs of unraveling do not point to one clean answer. They point to a society under strain, with different pressures landing on different people at different times. A weaker centre could make food problems worse. Food problems could fuel unrest. Unrest could require more defences. More defences required more timber and labour. More demands on ordinary people could weaken loyalty even further. It was a feedback loop, and the city had been built in one of the most productive landscapes in North America. But it was also built on a floodplain, a place where abundance could turn dangerous with one season of extreme water. And that is the danger of living beside a great river. The Mississippi floodplain could be astonishingly productive. Rich alluvial soils, easy access to water, fish, waterfowl, turtles, wild plants, forests and fields capable of growing enormous quantities of maize. It was exactly the kind of landscape that could support a city on Cahokia's scale. But floodplains are productive because rivers are restless. A river does not care where you built your house. It does not care where your maize is growing. It does not care that thousands of people are depending on a harvest. It shifts channels, rises over banks, saturates the ground, tears away soil in one place and deposits it somewhere else. In a good year that can renew the land, in a bad year it can destroy everything at once. And during the centuries surrounding Cahokia's decline, the climate itself appears to have become less reliable. Not necessarily one giant apocalypse, not one permanent drought that turned Illinois into a desert. The evidence points instead toward instability, shifting rainfall patterns, periods of drought, uncertain growing seasons, years when rain may have arrived too late, too hard, or not at all. And for a society increasingly dependent on maize agriculture, uncertainty was dangerous. Maize is an incredible crop when conditions cooperate. It produces large amounts of calories from relatively small fields. It can be dried and stored. It can feed families, workers, pilgrims, warriors, and the people organizing ceremonies at the center of a city. Maize was one of the foundations that made Cahokia possible. But it also creates dependence. A city with thousands of mouths cannot simply improvise its food supply every time the weather changes. Wild plants, hunting, fishing, and gathered foods could help. They were important, but they could not always replace a major shortfall in staple crops, especially for a population concentrated in and around a large urban centre. Think about the timing. You clear fields, you save seed from the previous year. You plant in spring, you wait for rain, you weed, you guard crops from animals. You organize labour around the expectation that months later, those fields will provide enough food to carry the community through winter. Then the rain does not come, or it comes after the seedlings have already failed. Or it comes all at once, pounding the fields in violent storms, washing soil away and flattening young plants. Or the river rises during the growing season and leaves low-lying fields under water. One bad harvest is a crisis, 2 bad harvests can force families to use stored seed corn just to survive. 3 bad harvests in a decade can change the politics of an entire region. Scientists studying climate records from the wider Midwest and Mississippi Valley have found evidence that conditions were not stable throughout Cahokia's final centuries. Tree rings, cave deposits, lake sediments, and other environmental archives suggest that parts of North America experienced major drought episodes during the medieval climate anomaly, the broad period of unusual climate conditions that lasted roughly from the 900s into the 1200s. But climate history is not simple. A drought recorded in one region does not mean every field around Cahokia dried up at the same time. Rainfall can vary dramatically across even short distances. One stream may fail while another still runs. One community may lose its crop, while another gets just enough rain to survive. And records from centuries ago cannot tell us exactly what happened in every single Cahokian field in every single year. Still, the larger pattern matters. Cahokia was not operating in a perfectly dependable climate. Its people may have faced repeated environmental surprises at precisely the moment their city needed reliability the most. And drought was only half the problem, because when rain did return, it could be destructive. The Mississippi and its tributaries are part of a huge drainage system. Rain falling far upstream can eventually affect communities hundreds of miles away. A season of heavy precipitation in distant regions could raise water levels across the floodplain. Local storms could overwhelm smaller streams and low-lying fields. Saturated ground could make planting difficult. Waterlogged maize roots can rot. Seeds can fail to germinate, and even when floodwaters recede, they can leave behind a landscape that needs time, labour, and luck to recover. Imagine being a Cahokian farmer watching the river rise. At first, maybe it is familiar. Seasonal flooding was part of life here. People understood water. They knew which ground sat higher, which fields were risky, which channels could change. They had lived in this landscape for generations, but then the water keeps coming. The lowest fields disappear beneath muddy currents. Storage pits become damp, paths turn to sludge, houses near the edge of a settlement are threatened. People scramble to move food, tools, children, whatever they can carry. And the problem is not only what the flood destroys today, it is what it prevents tomorrow. If you cannot plant on time, the harvest arrives late. If the harvest arrives late, an early frost becomes more dangerous. If the crop is weak, there is less food to store. If there is less food to store, every household becomes more vulnerable to the next drought, the next flood, the next conflict, the next demand for tribute or labour. That is how environmental stress becomes social stress. Not because climate reaches down from the sky and orders a city to collapse, but because it changes the choices people have available. A leader who once redistributed food during ceremonies may suddenly have less food to redistribute. A household that once contributed labour to mound construction may need every able-bodied person in the fields. A distant village may decide it cannot spare maize for Cahokia's elites when its own children are hungry. Traders may bring fewer goods. Pilgrims may stop arriving. Local communities may become less willing to accept demands from a centre that no longer seems able to guarantee abundance. And what happens when a political system has built part of its authority on the promise of cosmic order? Cahokia's leaders did not rule through food alone. They ruled through monuments, ceremonies, calendars, sacred spaces, and claims that the world was ordered in a meaningful way. The sun rose, the seasons turned, maize grew, the people gathered. The mounds stood at the centre of it all, but repeated failed harvests can make old promises sound hollow. If ceremonies continue and the crops still fail, people notice. If elites demand more labour while ordinary families are struggling to feed themselves, people notice. If the centre keeps asking for maize, wood and loyalty, while offering less security in return, people notice. That does not mean Cahokians suddenly rejected their beliefs. Human societies rarely work that way. Belief can endure through hardship. Ritual can become even more important during crisis. But environmental instability may have exposed tensions that had always existed beneath the surface, between farmers and leaders, between the crowded centre and outlying villages, between communities with access to safer land and communities trapped in vulnerable places. Climate did not have to destroy Cahokia by itself. It only had to make everything else harder. Harder to feed a giant population. Harder to maintain public works. Harder to keep neighbourhoods supplied. Harder to persuade people that the old system still worked. Harder to recover after violence, illness, or political conflict. A city already under pressure can survive one bad year. It may even survive several, but it cannot survive endless strain without changing. And Cahokia's dependence on the floodplain created another problem. The very landscape that had made its rise possible was not an unlimited source of wealth. Fields could be exhausted, forests could be cut back. Game could become scarce near a growing population. Each environmental shock landed on a society already asking more and more from the land around it. The climate may have turned against the floodplain, but Cahokia had also begun turning the floodplain into a machine that had to keep producing. And machines become fragile when every part is running at maximum capacity. And that is the hidden cost of building a city. Cahokia did not just need one good harvest. It needed good harvests again and again, year after year, across generations. It needed enough maize to feed the people living near the great mounds, enough to support artisans, ritual specialists, builders, traders, visitors and leaders, enough seed to plant next season, enough surplus to survive when the weather went wrong. That changes the relationship between people and land. A small village can shift its fields when soil starts losing fertility. It can leave a plot fallow for several years. It can hunt farther away, gather more wild foods, move a few miles toward better ground. But a metropolis is not so flexible. You cannot easily relocate thousands of people, hundreds of houses, storage areas, sacred plazas, and the political centre of an entire region. Cahokia needed fields close enough to work, productive enough to matter, and reliable enough to feed a dense population. And maize, for all its advantages, can be demanding. Maize pulls nutrients from the soil, especially nitrogen. If farmers plant it repeatedly in the same fields without enough time for the land to recover, yields can decline. The first years may be excellent. The soil of the Mississippi floodplain was naturally fertile, renewed in some places by flooding and rich in organic material. But fertile does not mean infinite. Think about what happens as the city grows. More people means more houses. More houses mean more land occupied by neighbourhoods, paths, storage pits, work areas, and ceremonial spaces. At the same time, more people mean more food. So fields have to expand outward. Land that was once forest, wetland or prairie gets cleared and planted. Farmers may work existing plots more intensely. Areas that once had time to rest are needed again the next season because the city cannot simply pause its appetite. And if harvests begin to weaken, the response can make the problem worse. You clear more land, you plant more maize, you ask more labour from households already under pressure. You cultivate fields farther from home. You rely more heavily on the best remaining ground. For a while that may work. A powerful centre can organise labour on a scale smaller communities cannot. It can direct people to clear land, build storage facilities, or move food from productive villages into the city. But that is not a permanent solution. It is a way of buying time. There is evidence that Cahokia's inhabitants did change the landscape dramatically. The forests around the city were not just scenery. They were an essential resource. Wood was everywhere in Cahokian life. Homes needed posts, walls, roofs, and repairs. Cooking fires needed fuel every day. Pottery firing required wood. Tools needed wooden handles. Baskets, mats, containers, and fences depended on forest materials. Mound construction may have involved wooden tools carrying frames and support structures. Ceremonial buildings and elite residences required timber. And then there was the Palisade. Cahokia's great defensive wall enclosed the central precinct for miles. It was rebuilt more than once. Thousands upon thousands of upright logs would have been needed, cut, transported, shaped, placed, and eventually replaced as wood rotted in the wet ground. Just imagine the labour. A tree comes down somewhere beyond the city. Its branches are stripped. The trunk is cut to size with stone tools. Then people drag or carry it across uneven ground, through mud, across streams, past fields and houses, into the centre of one of the largest settlements north of Mexico. And they do this not once, not for a few dozen posts, but potentially for vast numbers of them. The Palisade was not the only demand. Monks Mound itself required an almost unimaginable movement of earth, and earthworks on that scale often meant clearing vegetation, opening borrow pits, constructing ramps, and constantly managing erosion. The city's growth turned surrounding woodlands into a supply zone. Every new house and public building extended that demand. Every winter added another need for fuel. Could Cahokia have deforested its immediate surroundings? Possibly. Pollen records and sediment studies from the wider region suggest significant environmental change during the Mississippian period, including forest clearing and intensified agriculture. But the exact scale around Cahokia remains difficult to reconstruct. Trees leave less obvious archaeological evidence than stone walls. Wood decays. Fields are ploughed over. River sediments bury old landscapes. And even if forests declined, it can be hard to separate human cutting from natural changes in climate, fire, floods, and plant succession. That uncertainty matters. It would be easy to tell a simple story. Cahokia cut down every tree, exhausted every field, and starved. But archaeology does not support that kind of clean, single-cause ending. The people of Cahokia were not passive victims blindly destroying their own world. They understood their landscape, they managed plants, they used fire, they moved materials through trade networks. They could adapt. The real question is not whether every nearby forest vanished or every field failed. The question is whether the growing demand for land, timber and fuel made the entire system less resilient. Because resource strain does not have to mean total depletion. Maybe farmers had to walk farther to reach productive fields. Maybe households spent more time gathering firewood. Maybe good building timber became harder to find close to the city. Maybe clearing slopes and stream banks increased erosion, sending soil into low areas and waterways. Maybe heavy rains washed exposed earth off newly opened fields. Maybe forests that once slowed runoff and held soil together had become patchier. None of those changes alone would necessarily force people to abandon Cahokia. But together, they could make daily life more expensive. More labour for the same harvest, more travel for the same fuel, more effort to build and repair homes, more vulnerability when storms hit, more competition between a household's immediate needs and the demands of the city's elites. And Cahokians may have responded in practical ways. They could shift cultivation to different soils. They could rely more on villages beyond the crowded core. They could diversify food sources with beans, squash, wild plants, fish, deer, and waterfowl. They could reuse timber, manage surviving woodlands, or move homes and fields toward places where resources were still available. But those adaptations could also pull people away from the centre. If a family can grow food more reliably near a smaller outlying community, why remain close to a city that demands labour, tribute and constant access to scarce resources? If firewood, game and farmland are easier to reach beyond the dense urban zone, moving away is not necessarily defeat. It may be a rational decision, and when enough households make that decision, a giant city begins to shrink. Not overnight, not in one dramatic evacuation, but field by field, house by house, family by family. Cahokia had transformed the Mississippi floodplain into an engine of food, labour, wood and power. But by the end, that engine may have been consuming more than the landscape and the people living in it could comfortably provide. And when the landscape is under pressure, the pressure does not stay in the fields. It enters the body. Cahokia was doing something rare in North America, north of Mexico. It was concentrating people at a scale most of their ancestors had never experienced. Thousands of people living close together, houses clustered around plazas, food stored in pits and granaries, animals nearby. Waste accumulating, children growing up in dense neighbourhoods where a problem in one household could become a problem for many. Cities create opportunities. They bring together labour, knowledge, ceremony, trade, and political power. But they also create new risks. In a small, scattered village, an infection may burn through one family and stop. People have space. Water sources may be less crowded. Waste is spread over a wider area. A family can move camp, shift a garden, avoid a contaminated stream, or isolate itself from a sick neighbour. A city changes that equation. Now imagine a warm Mississippi summer. Heavy rain falls on packed earth, water runs through homes, paths, storage areas, and refuse pits. It can carry human waste, animal waste, spoiled food, and parasites toward the same low-lying places where people collect water, prepare meals, and children play. Flooding, which had always been part of life on the river, becomes more dangerous when there are thousands of people living on the floodplain. We cannot excavate a Cahokian disease outbreak the way we might identify a burned building or a collapsed wall. Most bacteria and viruses leave no clear signature after 900 years. A fever does not preserve. Diarrhea does not preserve. An epidemic that killed quickly may leave behind bodies, but not a label explaining what killed them. So archaeologists have to work indirectly. They study skeletons for signs of stress. They look at teeth, bones, joints, and injuries. They search for patterns that might reveal recurring hardship, interruptions in childhood growth, chronic infection, nutritional deficiencies, hard physical labour, or trauma. And some Cahokian remains do show evidence that life could be physically demanding. Teeth can preserve lines or pits in their enamel. Marks created when a child's body experiences serious stress while the tooth is forming. That stress could come from illness, malnutrition, severe seasonal hunger, or some combination of all three. Bones may show lesions associated with inflammation or infection. Joints can reveal years of repetitive labour. Fractures can show accidents, conflict, or simply the hazards of hauling wood, digging earth, farming fields, and living in a crowded settlement built from mud, timber, and fire. But every one of those clues has limits. A line in tooth enamel does not tell us whether a child had measles, parasites, famine, or a winter of poor food. A lesion on bone may have several possible causes. Even conditions once treated as simple evidence of anemia can result from different biological stresses. Skeletons do not come with medical records. What they can tell us is something broader and maybe more important. For at least some people, life at Cahokia was not consistently easy. Their bodies recorded episodes of strain. Food was central to that strain. Maize made Cahokia possible. It produced large harvests. It could be dried, stored, moved, and turned into a dependable source of calories. It helped support a population far larger than one based only on hunting, gathering, and small gardens could easily sustain. But dependence on maize came with a trade-off. Maize is excellent at providing energy. It is less complete as a food system when it becomes too dominant. It is relatively low in certain essential nutrients, and its protein quality is limited compared with a more varied diet. In Mesoamerica, people developed processing methods such as nixtamalization, cooking maize with alkaline materials, which can make some nutrients more available. We do not have clear evidence that Cahokians used that exact practice on the same scale. That does not mean Cahokians ate nothing but corn. They did not. Their food systems included beans, squash, nuts, wild plants, fish, deer, waterfowl, and other animals. Different households may have had access to different resources. Seasons change diets. Social status may have changed diets too. A person living near the centre of power, receiving food through tribute or ceremonial distribution, may not have eaten the same meals as a farming family on the edge of the settlement. But the more a city depends on one staple, the more dangerous a bad year becomes. If floods damage maize fields, if drought shrinks yields, if pests strike, if stored grain spoils, or if labour shortages leave fields unworked, there is no easy substitute for thousands of missing meals. Wild foods can help, hunting can help, trade can help. But none of those can instantly replace the calories of a failed staple crop for a city this large. And hunger is not always starvation. Sometimes it is a lean season before the harvest comes in. Sometimes it is children receiving less protein because adults are rationing what remains. Sometimes it is food stores running low after a flood. Sometimes it is a household selling, trading, or surrendering part of its surplus, while hoping next year will be better. Those smaller shortages weaken people long before they kill them. A poorly nourished child is more vulnerable to infection. A person already fighting parasites has less reserve when food becomes scarce. Repeated illness can limit growth, reduce strength, complicate pregnancy, and make everyday injuries harder to recover from. In a crowded city, disease and nutrition do not act separately. They reinforce each other, and Cahokia had plenty of pathways for that cycle. Water drawn from rivers, ponds, or shallow sources could be contaminated, especially after floods. Refuse disposal becomes harder as population density rises. Domestic animals and pests can carry disease organisms. Intestinal parasites thrive where sanitation is strained. Food storage protects a community against hunger, but stored food can also attract rodents, insects, and mold if conditions go wrong. None of this proves that Cahokia was devastated by a single epidemic. There is no archaeological evidence that lets us say with confidence that one disease swept through the city and emptied it. No preserved pathogen, no unmistakable mass burial tied to a known outbreak. No ancient Cahokian account describing a plague, but disease does not need to arrive as one spectacular catastrophe to matter. It could have been seasonal, recurrent, unevenly distributed. More dangerous during floods, crop failures, or cold winters. It could have killed infants and elders, weakened workers, disrupted households, and made every other crisis harder to manage. A city already struggling with unstable harvests, exhausted nearby resources, and growing social demands would have had less room for sickness. And when people begin to believe that the centre can no longer keep them fed, healthy, or safe, they do not need one final disaster to leave. They only need enough reasons, repeated often enough, to decide that life somewhere else might be better. And when people begin leaving because life elsewhere looks safer, that decision can change the city itself. A household moves away, then another. Fields farther from the centre are abandoned. Trade partners become less reliable. Leaders have fewer goods to redistribute, fewer workers to call on, fewer people willing to obey old obligations. Under those conditions, conflict becomes more likely, not inevitable. More likely this matters, because Cahokia's final centuries contain evidence that can be read through the lens of violence. Some human remains show injuries. Some settlements in the wider region were fortified. Cahokia itself was enclosed, at least in part, by a massive wooden palisade. And several burials, especially those associated with Mound 72, raise difficult questions about ritual killing, coercion, status and power. But this is where the story can easily become too simple. A wound on a skeleton is not automatically proof of war. A wall is not automatically proof of invasion. A mass burial is not automatically evidence of a massacre. Archaeology deals in physical traces, but the meanings behind those traces are often contested. Still, the traces tell us that violence was part of Cahokia's world. Some individuals buried at Cahokia show signs of trauma, fractures, blows and injuries that may have occurred near the time of death. In a city built around hard labour, some broken bones came from accidents. People fell, trees collapsed, heavy loads shifted. Farming tools, fire, animals and crowded houses all created hazards. But certain injuries are harder to explain away. A wound to the head, a cut associated with a weapon, or skeletal damage suggesting a violent death can point toward interpersonal conflict. That conflict might have been a raid, it might have been a fight between neighbours, it might have been punishment, it might have been a political killing. The bones can sometimes show violence occurred. They cannot always tell us who struck first, why they did it, or whether the victim knew their killer. And by Cahokia's later history, there were reasons for tensions to rise. Food pressure, flood risk, disease, unequal access to resources, demands for labour, competition among leaders, conflict with neighbouring communities. All of these can turn ordinary disagreements into something more dangerous. Think about what happens when a harvest falls short. Someone still has to decide who gets the stored grain. Someone decides which households contribute labour to repair a wall, rebuild a house, dig a drainage ditch, or maintain a ceremonial precinct. Someone decides whether tribute still flows toward the centre when farmers are already worried about feeding their own children. Those decisions are political. In good years, authority can look like generosity. Elites organise ceremonies, distribute food, sponsor construction, and connect people to distant trade networks and sacred power. But in bad years, the same system can look very different. Collection becomes extraction, labour obligations become burdens. Ritual promises become harder to believe, and that is when status differences can become explosive. Cahokia was not a community of equals. Its monuments, burial patterns and settlement layout all suggest social hierarchy. Some people had greater access to prestige goods, powerful locations, ceremonial roles, and perhaps better food. Others carried out the daily work that kept the city alive, farming, hauling timber, building walls, digging earth, processing food, and maintaining homes. Hierarchy does not automatically mean rebellion. Complex societies can endure inequality for centuries when people see the system as legitimate, useful, or sacred. But legitimacy has to be maintained. If the rulers claim special access to the forces governing rain, harvests, ancestors, or the movement of the sky, repeated disaster creates a problem. If floods keep coming, if food stores fail, if sickness spreads, if enemies threaten the outskirts, people may begin asking a dangerous question. Why are we still obeying them? The burials at Mound 72 bring that question into sharp focus. Mound 72 contained several unusual burial features, including the remains of a high-status man buried with elaborate offerings and many thousands of marine shell beads. Nearby were group burials that included large numbers of people, among them a famous deposit containing dozens of young women. For decades, this was often described in dramatic language: human sacrifice, retainers killed to accompany an elite man into death, evidence of a ruthless ruling class. Some aspects of the burial do support the possibility of ritual killing. The way some bodies were placed, the grouping of individuals, and evidence that at least some may have died around the same time suggest these were not ordinary family burials. But the details are more complicated than the popular version. Not every burial in Mound 72 necessarily represents sacrifice. Some deposits may include people who died at different times. Some individuals may have been moved after initial burial. Interpretations of age, sex, burial sequence, and cause of death have changed as researchers re-examined the evidence. The famous group of young women, once presented as a neatly uniform set of sacrificial victims, may have included a more varied population than early accounts suggested. So we should be careful. Mound 72 does not give us a simple image of a king ordering hundreds of captives executed in one terrible moment. But it does show that Cahokia's ritual world could involve death on a large and deeply unequal scale. Whether every person was killed by force, selected as an attendant, treated as an enemy, or buried through some other ceremonial process, these were events designed to communicate power. That distinction matters. Ritual violence is not the same thing as warfare. Warfare is not the same as execution. Execution is not the same as murder. And murder is not the same as political collapse, but all can exist in the same society. A ruler may use ritual killing to demonstrate authority. A community may build walls because it fears raids. A faction may punish rivals while claiming sacred justification. A hungry population may fight over food without launching a rebellion against the entire system. The categories overlap. The evidence does not always let us separate them cleanly. Cahokia's Palisade is another clue with multiple meanings. The wall enclosed the central precinct and was rebuilt more than once. Constructing it required an enormous investment of timber, labour, planning and coordination. It may have served practical defensive purposes. A tall wooden barrier with watchpoints and controlled entrances could make it harder for attackers to enter the ceremonial core. But walls also send messages. They separate insiders from outsiders. They control movement. They protect sacred spaces. They make authority visible. A palisade could have defended Cahokia from external enemies, while also allowing leaders to regulate access to the city's most important places. And if the wall was rebuilt during times of stress, that may suggest fear was becoming a permanent feature of life. Not necessarily fear of one invading army. It could have been fear of raids. Fear of rival communities, fear of unrest within the city, fear that the old order was no longer secure enough to stand without a barrier around it. Across the broader Mississippi Valley, fortified settlements became more common in some later periods. That pattern does not prove a single regional war, and it does not mean every village lived under constant attack. But it suggests that many communities believed defense was worth the enormous labor it required. That alone tells us something had changed. A society that once drew people toward its center through ceremony, trade, and opportunity may eventually have faced a different reality, people protecting themselves, their food, and their families from one another. Maybe Cahokia was attacked. Maybe some of its people fought each other. Maybe political factions challenged the leaders who had once directed mound building and ritual life. Maybe outsiders took advantage of a weakening center. Maybe all of these happened in different places, at different times. The archaeological record cannot give us one final battle, one coup, or one moment when the city broke apart. What it gives us is a picture of mounting strain, a city under environmental pressure, a population facing sickness and uneven food security, a ruling order dependent on labour, belief and redistribution, a landscape where walls became necessary, injuries occurred, and death itself could be used as a statement of power. And when power has to be displayed more forcefully, it may be because fewer people believe in it willingly. But power is not held together by force alone. A wall can keep people out. It can control who enters a sacred precinct. It can protect food stores, elite residences, and ceremonial spaces. But it cannot make people believe that the people inside that wall still deserve to rule. For that, Cahokia's leaders may have needed something more powerful than soldiers or labour crews. They needed the world to make sense. We do not know exactly how Cahokian religion worked. There are no surviving texts explaining what a ruler said before a ceremony, what prayers were spoken at sunrise, or what ordinary families believed happened after death. There is no Cahokian equivalent of a royal inscription saying, "I brought the rain. I defeated famine. The sky favours my family, but the city's layout gives us clues." Monks Mound dominated the landscape. Plazas created space for enormous public gatherings. Woodhenges marked movements of the sun across the year. Mounds organised the city into a ceremonial geography where height, direction, ancestors, seasons and political authority may all have been connected. This was not just architecture, it may have been a claim about how the universe was ordered. Imagine what it meant to live in Cahokia at its height. The sun rises at a particular point on the horizon. The people responsible for the ceremonies know where to stand. They know when to gather. They know when to plant, when to feast, when to mourn, when to build. From the top of the great mound, leaders look out across the plaza and the neighbourhoods beyond it. They appear elevated not just physically, but spiritually. The message may have been clear. The world has an order. We understand that order. Follow us and prosperity follows. In many early societies, political power and sacred authority are deeply intertwined. A leader does not have to claim to be a god. Sometimes it is enough to claim special access to ancestors, seasonal knowledge, cosmic forces, or rituals that keep the community in balance. If harvests are good, if trade goods arrive, if ceremonies bring people together, that claim can become extremely convincing. Success looks like proof. A full granary can look like divine favour. A successful ceremony can look like confirmation that the sun is still moving correctly, the ancestors are still listening, and the people directing the ritual still know what they are doing. But this kind of authority has a weakness. What happens when the harvest fails anyway? What happens when the river floods fields at the wrong time? When drought hardens the soil? When disease takes children and elders? When food becomes scarce and leaders still demand labour for walls, mounds, ceremonies, or their own households? A political system built partly on sacred credibility can survive one bad year. Maybe even several people understand that nature is unpredictable. No leader controls every storm, but repeated crisis is different. Repeated crisis turns misfortune into a question, not just why did this happen, but why did the people who promised order fail to prevent it? This does not mean Cahokians suddenly stop believing in religion. That is probably the wrong way to think about it. Societies under stress often become more ritualized, not less. People may hold more ceremonies, seek new spiritual specialists, make larger offerings, or turn toward older local traditions when familiar answers stop working. The issue may not have been belief versus disbelief. It may have been whose beliefs mattered. Maybe the ceremonies centered on Cahokia's great plazas no longer seem sufficient to people living on the edges of the city. Maybe farmers trusted local leaders who understood their own fields and streams better than distant elites on monumental platforms. Maybe communities began organizing rituals around their own ancestors, their own sacred places, their own seasonal calendars. That kind of shift would be politically enormous, and archaeologically it is almost invisible. Archaeologists can identify changes in settlement patterns. They can see fewer people living near the urban core. They can map the growth of smaller communities in surrounding regions. They can track changes in pottery styles, house forms, food remains, and the movement of trade goods. What they cannot excavate directly is confidence. They cannot uncover a clay tablet saying, "The old leaders have lost the mandate of the sky." They cannot dig up a house floor and prove that one family decided the ceremonies at Cahokia no longer meant anything to them. Ideological change does not fossilize, it leaves indirect traces. A monument stops being maintained. A plaza is used differently. Long-distance prestige goods become less important. People move away from the centre and invest their labour closer to home. New local centres emerge while the old capital loses population. Each clue can have several explanations. A smaller settlement might grow because farmland was better there. It might grow because a trade route shifted. It might grow because people wanted distance from violence or disease. Or it might grow because authority was becoming decentralised. Instead of one huge ceremonial centre pulling people toward it, the region may have begun breaking into smaller political worlds. Local leaders, local ritual spaces, local alliances, local identities. Think of it like a giant fire losing its centre. At Cahokia's peak, fuel, labour, food, trade and belief were drawn toward one blazing core. But when that core weakened, the fire did not necessarily go out. It scattered. Smaller flames appeared across the landscape, each one sustained by nearby wood, nearby people, nearby needs. That is one possible way to understand what happened after Cahokia's decline. Not a population that vanished, not a civilization that simply forgot how to organize itself, but a region where people increasingly chose smaller, more flexible forms of community over the demands of a troubled metropolis. And if that happened, it would make sense. When centralized authority succeeds, it can coordinate incredible things. It can build Monks Mound. It can call thousands into a plaza. It can direct labor, move goods across vast distances, and create a city unlike anything else north of Mexico. But when centralized authority fails, the same scale becomes a burden. The center asks for food when food is scarce. It asks for workers when families need help at home. It promises cosmic order while floods, hunger, sickness, and conflict keep returning. Eventually, people may not need to overthrow the system. They may simply stop coming. They may take their families, their seeds, their stories, and their sacred obligations somewhere else. And that is probably the most important point. Cahokia was not a magic trick. Its people did not wake up one morning, walk into the Mississippi River, and vanish from history. That image is dramatic. It is also almost certainly wrong. The decline of Cahokia appears to have been a process. Slow in some places, sudden in others, different for different families. Across the 13th century, the enormous urban core began losing people. Neighbourhoods that had once been crowded with houses became less dense. Some structures were abandoned and not rebuilt. Public spaces changed. The intense labour that had maintained monuments, palisades, plazas, and elite precincts seems to have become harder to organise. By the 14th century, Cahokia was no longer the giant it had been. But a declining city is not the same thing as an empty landscape. The people who had made Cahokia possible still had homes to build, children to feed, fields to plant, ceremonies to perform, alliances to maintain. They had knowledge of the river valleys, the forests, the wetlands, the seasonal cycles of maize, squash, beans, fish, deer, waterfowl, and wild plants. They had kin living beyond the city. They had trade partners, marriage ties, old homeland connections, and probably memories of places their grandparents had come from before Cahokia became enormous. When life at the centre became dangerous, expensive, unstable, or simply less rewarding, leaving may not have felt like the end of the world. It may have felt like going home. Imagine a family living near Cahokia in the late 1200s. Maybe the fields near their neighbourhood have been exhausted. Maybe flooding has ruined a harvest. Maybe food is more tightly controlled than it used to be. Maybe disease has passed through their community. Maybe the Palisade is being rebuilt again, and leaders are demanding labour at exactly the moment that everyone needs to repair their own house and prepare their own fields. Then a relative arrives from a smaller settlement upriver. There is good land there, fewer people, a creek that does not flood as violently, woods nearby for fuel and game, familiar families already living there, space to build a house close to people you trust. You do not have to reject Cahokia completely to make that choice. You just have to decide that your family has a better chance somewhere else. And thousands of individual decisions like that can empty a city. Not overnight, not with one final dramatic march, but season by season. Household by household, one family leaves after a bad flood, another after a violent dispute, another because an uncle offers land in a neighbouring valley, another because their local ceremonial leader has become more important to them than distant authorities on a giant mound. Over time, the centre loses the very thing that made it powerful. People, archaeologists see evidence that communities were growing or continuing in surrounding parts of the Mississippi Valley and beyond. Some people likely moved into nearby uplands, where they could avoid the worst floodplain risks. Others may have followed tributary valleys, settling beside smaller rivers and streams where water, soil, timber, and wild resources could be managed on a more local scale. Still others may have joined emerging regional communities in what are now parts of Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Indiana, Tennessee, and farther south along the Mississippi drainage. This does not mean every former Cahokian went in one direction. There was no single evacuation route. Cahokia had drawn people from a wide region during its rise. Its decline may have sent people outward through many of those same networks. Think of it less like a city being switched off, and more like a great river breaking into channels. At its peak, Cahokia had concentrated people, labour, food, and ritual power into one extraordinary place. But under pressure, that concentration could become a liability. A household living in a smaller village did not need thousands of strangers to cooperate before it could repair a roof, defend a field, or organise a harvest. Local leaders could respond to local problems. Rituals could be held closer to home. Food could stay closer to the people who grew it. Smaller communities may have offered something Cahokia no longer could: flexibility. And that makes migration sound less like failure. It can be an adaptation. Modern people often imagine that moving away from a city means collapse. But for agricultural societies facing floods, drought, conflict, disease, and political instability, dispersal can be smart. It spreads risk. It reduces pressure on nearby forests and soils. It puts families closer to their own food supplies. It makes one bad decision by a distant elite less capable of ruining everyone's life. Cahokia's people may not have abandoned civilization. They may have abandoned one particular way of organizing it. But tracing those people is difficult. Archaeology can follow objects more easily than identities. A pottery style can spread because migrants carried it, or because neighbouring communities copied it. A house pattern can indicate a shared tradition, or it can simply be a practical solution to the same climate. A new settlement may include people from Cahokia, descendants of older local populations, newcomers from elsewhere, or all three together. And unlike later societies, Cahokia left no census records. No passenger lists, no letters saying, "We left the great city in the year of the flood and settled near the uplands." No map marking where every neighbourhood went. The silence is frustrating, but it should not be mistaken for absence. People do not disappear just because their names were never written down. Their descendants may have carried pieces of Cahokia with them, ways of building houses, planting maize, making pottery, organising ceremonies, honouring ancestors, using sacred symbols, and understanding the layered world of sky, earth, water, and the dead. Mississippian traditions did not end when Cahokia declined. They continued, changed, mixed with local practices, and appeared in communities across much of eastern North America for centuries afterward. The great city lost its dominance. Its ideas did not simply die with it. That is why Cahokia's final centuries are so important. They force us to look past the ruins and ask a better question. Not why did everyone vanish? But how did people survive when the biggest city they had ever known stopped working? The answer may be that they did what human communities have always done in a crisis. They adapted. They moved. They reorganized. They carried what mattered forward. And somewhere beyond the emptying plazas and weathered mounds, new communities were already taking shape. The new communities were already taking shape, and they did not emerge into an empty world. For centuries after Cahokia's major decline, Indigenous people continued to live, farm, hunt, travel, trade, and hold ceremonies across the Mississippi Valley. The giant urban centre had lost its old scale, its plazas no longer filled with tens of thousands of people. Its neighbourhoods were no longer packed with houses. But the rivers, forests, wetlands, and fertile soils that had supported Cahokia were still there. So were the trails. So were the old exchange routes. So were places that generations had known as powerful. Some communities occupied parts of the region near the old city. Others lived along tributary valleys, in uplands, beside smaller streams, and across the broader Midwest and Southeast. Archaeologists can trace changing pottery traditions, settlement patterns, foodways, and ceremonial practices. They can see that Mississippian culture continued long after Cahokia stopped being the dominant centre. But continuity is not always a straight line. This is where the story becomes difficult. Not because Indigenous history disappears, but because the evidence has been broken apart by time, migration, political change, and eventually colonial violence on a massive scale. Between Cahokia's decline and the arrival of Europeans in the Mississippi Valley, more than 3 centuries passed. That is longer than the entire history of the United States as an independent country. Entire nations can rise, move, divide, merge, and transform in that amount of time. Languages change, alliances shift. Old sacred places gain new meanings. Families carry memories forward, but not always in forms that outsiders can easily recognize. Then, European colonization made the problem even worse. By the 17th century, French explorers, missionaries, traders, and soldiers were entering a continent already devastated by epidemic disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other old world diseases moved through native communities with terrifying speed. In many regions they arrived ahead of direct European contact, passed from community to community through trade and travel networks. The exact scale varied from place to place, but the result was catastrophic population loss, political disruption, forced migration, warfare, and the collapse or reorganization of long-established communities. Imagine trying to preserve a family history while people are dying around you, villages are relocating, enemies are raiding, foreign traders are demanding alliances, and your homeland is being claimed by people who do not recognize your laws, your boundaries, or your right to remain there. That kind of disruption does not erase indigenous memory, but it can make a simple, unbroken chain from a 14th century city to a 19th century written record almost impossible to reconstruct. And that matters, because for a long time outsiders treated that difficulty as proof that Cahokia had no descendants. That was never a reasonable conclusion. A city does not need to leave behind a nation with the exact same name, in the exact same location, speaking the exact same language, for its people and their traditions to have continued. Cahokia was part of a much larger indigenous world. Its residents had connections stretching across the Mississippi drainage and far beyond it. Their descendants may have entered many later communities. Their ideas, symbols, agricultural practices, and ceremonial traditions may have travelled much farther than the people who first built the mounds. The name Cahokia, meanwhile, is itself a reminder of how history gets layered. The people who built the great city did not leave us a written name for it. Cahokia comes from a later Illinois-speaking people known to French colonists in the 17th century. The Cahokia were part of the wider Illinois, or Illinois Confederation, and lived in the region when French observers arrived. European writers eventually attached their name to the nearby mounds. So Cahokia is the name we use today, but it may not be the name its builders used. The original name could have been lost, or it could survive in ways archaeology cannot read. Maybe it was carried in oral traditions that colonial disruptions scattered. Maybe the city had several names, depending on who was speaking. Maybe its most important name was sacred, and never meant to be spoken casually at all. We do not know. What we do know is that when early American observers began describing the mounds in detail, they were already looking at a landscape that had been altered, occupied, renamed, and claimed by generations of people. In the early 1800s, antiquarians such as Henry Marie Brackenridge walked among these enormous earthworks and struggled to understand what they were seeing. Brackenridge described a vast complex of mounds near the Mississippi, including the huge platform mound we now call Monks Mound. To him the place seemed almost unbelievable. Here was evidence that a major indigenous city had existed in a country many Americans still imagined as empty wilderness before European settlement. But even as people began recognizing Cahokia's importance, they were helping destroy it. That is one of the darkest ironies in the entire story. The land around the mounds was farmed, ploughs cut into ancient house floors, trash pits, burials and walls. Repeated cultivation gradually flattened smaller mounds and erased subtle features that archaeologists would desperately want to examine today. Roads, rail lines, drainage projects, industrial development, and urban expansion sliced through the old landscape. Looters dug into mounds searching for objects they could sell or keep. Construction destroyed sites before anyone had documented them. Across the river, in what is now St. Louis, dozens of major mounds once stood. The city was known as Mound City. Most of those mounds were levelled for streets, buildings, railroads and development. Gone. Not because they were unimportant, because the people making decisions did not believe indigenous history deserved the same protection as a European cathedral, a colonial battlefield, or a president's house. Cahokia survived better than many sites, but better does not mean untouched. A highway now runs through part of the ancient metropolitan area. Modern development has narrowed the space available for excavation and preservation. Much of the city remains buried beneath fields, roads, neighbourhoods and infrastructure. Every shovel in this landscape raises the same question. Are we uncovering history or destroying the last chance to understand it? That is why preservation matters. Cahokia Mounds was protected as a state historic site in the 20th century, and later recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Archaeologists have mapped neighbourhoods, studied ancient soils, analysed animal bones, reconstructed palisades, and used new technologies to find buried features without digging everywhere. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, drone mapping, chemical analysis, and microscopic plant remains are revealing a city far more complicated than earlier generations imagined. But archaeology is not the only voice that matters. For Indigenous communities, Cahokia is not simply a puzzle about a vanished people. It is part of a living native landscape. The mounds are ancestral places. They are connected to traditions of earth, water, sky, ceremony, agriculture, kinship, and responsibility that did not vanish when the city declined or when colonial records became fragmented. That perspective changes the question. Instead of asking only, what destroyed Cahokia? We also have to ask, what do we owe the people whose history was buried, renamed, excavated, and too often treated as someone else's property? Because Cahokia is not just an ancient mystery. It is a living heritage issue. Its mounds still stand above the floodplain. Its descendants cannot be reduced to a single label. Its meaning is still being argued over, protected, challenged, and reclaimed. And every new discovery reminds us that the city was never truly silent. We just spent a very long time failing to listen. And that may be the deepest lesson of Cahokia. We want mysteries to have clean endings. A city rises. Something terrible happens. Everyone disappears overnight. Centuries pass. Nobody knows why. It is a powerful story. It is dramatic. And it is probably wrong. Cahokia was not a camp that vanished when one storm came through. It was not a single palace whose fall brought the whole society down in a day. At its height, this was one of the greatest indigenous cities ever built north of Mexico. A place of enormous mounds, planned plazas, crowded neighborhoods, sacred monuments, political authority, trade routes, ceremonies, farmers, craftspeople, builders, hunters, migrants, families and visitors arriving from far beyond the Mississippi floodplain. For generations, people made this city work. They moved impossible amounts of earth without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals. They built Monks Mound layer by layer. They raised walls, maintained houses, planted fields, managed woodlands, navigated waterways, made pottery, produced tools, and created a centre powerful enough to influence communities hundreds of miles away. That achievement did not vanish because its people were somehow primitive, weak, or incapable. If Cahokia declined, it declined because even extraordinary societies can face pressures bigger than any one decision. And the evidence points less toward one sudden night of abandonment than toward a long, complicated process. A process that unfolded across generations, some neighborhoods thinning out, some families leaving, new conflicts emerging, old political arrangements becoming harder to sustain, floods changing the floodplain, harvests becoming less reliable, resources growing scarce, health problems spreading through a dense population, faith in leaders and institutions being tested when the world no longer behaved as it was supposed to. Maybe climate instability made farming more difficult. Maybe repeated flooding damaged homes, fields, and food stores, while drought in other years created a different kind of crisis. Maybe the city had pushed its surrounding landscape too hard, cutting forests faster than they could recover, and demanding more maize from soils under increasing pressure. Maybe crowded living conditions made disease and nutritional stress more dangerous. Maybe violence between groups intensified as resources, authority, and security became uncertain. Maybe political leaders promised stability, spiritual protection, or access to the forces governing the sky and seasons. And maybe when those promises seemed to fail, people began making different choices. They did not need to wait for every problem to become unbearable. A family could leave because land elsewhere looked better. A village could relocate because it no longer trusted the city's leaders. A trading partner could choose another route. A faction could break away. A farmer could decide that living near relatives in a smaller settlement was safer than staying in a crowded urban centre surrounded by walls. Now multiply those decisions by hundreds, then thousands across decades. That is how a metropolis can unravel, not with one final scream, but with fewer cooking fires in the morning, more empty houses, fields no longer planted, plazas that once held enormous gatherings becoming quieter year after year, palisades repaired, then left to decay. Public monuments still standing, but with fewer people available or willing to maintain the system that gave them meaning. This is why no single explanation completely solves Cahokia. Flooding is real, but floodwater alone does not explain every abandoned neighbourhood. Climate change matters, but people had always adapted to changing weather. Resource strain may have made life harder, but it cannot by itself tell us why political authority weakened when it did. Violence appears in the archaeological record, but not every resident died violently. Disease and malnutrition may have contributed, but ancient illness is difficult to measure with certainty, and health pressures do not automatically cause cities to empty. Every theory explains part of the pattern. None explains all of it. And maybe that is exactly what we should expect. Human societies are not machines with one switch that turns them on or off. They are networks of relationships. Food systems, families, beliefs, landscapes, trade, labour, memory, conflict, leadership, weather, and hope, all tied together. When enough of those connections come under stress at the same time, the result is not always collapse in the simple sense. Sometimes it is transformation. Cahokia's people were not erased from history. They did not walk into darkness and cease to exist. They moved, they joined other communities, they carried farming knowledge, stories, artistic traditions, ceremonial practices, kinship ties, and memories of a world their ancestors had built on the Mississippi floodplain. The city changed, its people changed with it, and that may be harder to imagine than an overnight disappearance, because it denies us a neat ending. It asks us to see Cahokia not as a dead civilization frozen beneath the grass, but as part of a living indigenous history that continued through movement, adaptation, survival, and renewal. The mounds remain because Earth lasts, but the people were never just the mounds. They were the hands that carried baskets of soil, the farmers watching the river, the children growing up beneath the shadow of Monks Mound, the pilgrims arriving from distant lands, the leaders trying to hold a vast community together, the families who eventually made the difficult decision to leave, and the descendants who carried pieces of Cahokia forward into a changing world. So the real mystery is not simply why was North America's largest city abandoned? It is this: how do great societies change when the systems that made them powerful begin to fail? And how do ordinary people preserve what matters when they have to build a new life somewhere else? Cahokia does not give us one easy answer. It gives us a warning about the fragility of complex worlds. It gives us evidence of astonishing human creativity. And it gives us a reminder that decline is not the same thing as disappearance. If you enjoyed this journey into one of North America's greatest ancient cities, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is in the description.